Sydney needs this place more than you do, my father declared, tossing a copied key onto my kitchen island while my sister began dragging her suitcases toward my master bedroom. Her husband immediately started pacing the floor, claiming my home office as his new startup headquarters. I did not scream or cry. I simply smiled, muted my video call, and dialed building security. Yes, this is the owner of Penthouse 2300. I have intruders. My father's smug grin vanished instantly. My name is Madeline. I am 30 years old and the CEO of a luxury event management firm. Before I tell you how my family's hostile invasion of my home backfired spectacularly, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to set a hard boundary with toxic relatives who felt entitled to your hard work. It was a Tuesday morning, and the Miami sun was streaming through the windows of Penthouse 2300. I was hosting a crucial virtual meeting with a major corporate client. The heavy click of the front door unlocking echoed through the entryway. I frowned. The voices that drifted down the hallway made my blood run cold. They were loud, entitled, and completely out of place in my home. My father, Thomas, marched into my living room leading the charge. Behind him came my mother, Brenda. Then came my younger sister, Sydney, heavily pregnant. Finally, her husband, Terrence, an African-American man who carried himself with the unearned confidence of a billionaire, despite not having held a steady job in years, dragged 5 massive suitcases across my immaculate hardwood floors. Thomas marched straight to the kitchen island and tossed a brass key onto the marble surface. It was the emergency spare I had given my mother 2 years ago. "We are moving them in," Thomas announced, crossing his arms over his chest. "Sydney is pregnant, Madeline. She and Terrence need a stable environment for the baby. This place is huge, and you are just a single woman who only works. You do not need a penthouse all to yourself. You will take the small guest room and clear out the master bedroom for your sister." Terrence did not even wait for my response. My parents had drained their retirement savings to fund his latest cryptocurrency startup. "This open concept is wrong for a hub," Terrence said, waving his hand dismissively at my curated art collection. "I am going to need to knock down that partition wall over there. We will put the server racks in the dining area and my executive desk right by the window. You will have to move your little event planning stuff somewhere else, Madeline. I cannot have clients seeing glitter and fabric swatches when we are discussing high-level tech investments." Meanwhile, Sydney had already abandoned her suitcases in the middle of the floor. She unzipped the largest one and began pulling out her maternity clothes. She did not even look at me. She just hummed a tuneless song, picking up a framed photograph of me with a client and tossing it face down on the side table to make room for her makeup bag. "It smells too sterile in here," Sydney complained, wrinkling her nose. "Terrence reminded me to order those essential oil diffusers. We need to cleanse the energy before the baby arrives." "Madeline, you really should get some actual color in here. Black and white is so depressing. No wonder you are still single." Brenda had bypassed the living room entirely and headed straight for my kitchen. She opened the refrigerator door, examining the contents with a scowl. "Madeline, there is absolutely no real food in here," she declared. "Sydney needs proper nutrition for my grandchild. You are going to need to go to the grocery store immediately. Make sure you get organic whole milk and the specific brand of vitamins she likes, and pay with your card. Dear Terrence is waiting on some major investments to clear, so their accounts are tied up right now." The sheer audacity washed over me. When I started my firm, I worked out of a cramped studio with zero support. But when Terrence wanted to play tech mogul, they handed over their life savings. They looked at my penthouse and saw an easy solution to the mess they had created for themselves. They assumed because I was their daughter and sister, I would simply bow my head and hand over the keys to my kingdom. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with. I simply walked over to the kitchen island, picked up the spare key my father had thrown down, and slipped it into my pocket. The silence in the room suddenly became deafening as they waited for my reaction. I looked at Thomas, then at Brenda, then at Sydney, unpacking her life onto my furniture, and finally at Terrence, who was sizing up my walls for demolition. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my voice perfectly level. Thomas frowned. I said you need to clear out the master bedroom, Madeline. Start packing your things. Sydney needs to rest. Terence scoffed, crossing his arms. Do not play games, Madeline. Your dad is the one who secured this place for you, right? You are just a tenant. We are family. We have a right to be here. He was so deeply misinformed it was almost comical. My parents genuinely believed I was renting this penthouse. 5 years ago, when I first moved to Miami, I had a modest apartment, and Thomas had reluctantly co-signed the lease. He had no idea that 3 years ago my firm had secured a massive contract allowing me to purchase Penthouse 2300 outright. I am not a tenant, Terence, I said. I own every square inch of this property. Sydney rolled her eyes, tossing a handful of maternity dresses onto an armchair. Stop lying, Madeline. Mom told us you rent. Just go clean the guest room. I am exhausted and my feet are swelling. I ignored her complaints and tapped the emergency speed dial on my phone, connecting directly to the building security desk. They answered on the first ring. This is Madeline, the owner of Penthouse 2300, I said, keeping my gaze fixed on my father, whose face was beginning to flush with anger. I have 4 unauthorized individuals who used a stolen key to enter my private residence. I need them removed immediately, and please dispatch the Miami police. This is a hostile intrusion. I calmly ended the call and slipped the phone back into my blazer pocket. The absolute look of sheer shock on their faces was a portrait of shattered entitlement. The home invasion had begun, but my family had severely miscalculated the strength of the fortress they were trying to conquer. My father let out a booming theatrical laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling of my living room. He genuinely believed I was playing a game of chicken that I lacked the nerve to win. Shaking his head in mock pity, he reached into the breast pocket of his golf jacket and produced a folded, crinkled piece of paper. He waved it in the air like a winning lottery ticket, a victorious sneer plastered across his face. You really think the police are going to throw us out of a property I secured for you? Thomas scoffed, taking a step closer to my kitchen island. I co-signed your lease, Madeline. 5 years ago, I put my name on the line so you would not be living on the street. As your guarantor and your father, I am exercising my family rights. We are repurposing this rental. You can either stay in the small guest room or pack your bags and find somewhere else to live. It was astonishing to witness such blind arrogance. He was clutching a 5-year-old expired rental agreement for a completely different apartment complex across town. He had not even bothered to read the address or the expiration date. He just assumed I was still the struggling 25-year-old girl desperate for his financial validation. He looked around the massive sunlit penthouse with its panoramic views of the Miami skyline and somehow convinced himself that his signature on a defunct document gave him dominion over my entire existence. Terence did not even pause his destructive planning to acknowledge the threat of law enforcement. He casually kicked my expensive Italian leather ottoman out of the way to measure the floor space with his designer sneakers. Do not worry about the cops, Thomas Terence said smoothly, running a hand over his neatly trimmed beard. When they get here, I will handle them. I know how to talk to local law enforcement. I will just explain that my sister-in-law is having a manic episode and needs some time to cool off. This place is going to be perfect for my new blockchain hub once we clear out all this feminine clutter. Meanwhile, Sydney had moved into the kitchen and was loudly complaining about the lack of snacks. Honestly, Madeline, if you knew we were coming, you could have at least stocked the pantry, she whined, slamming a cabinet door shut. I am eating for 2, and all you have is sparkling water and espresso pods. Terence reminded me to use her credit card to order premium groceries. Heavy fists pounded on the solid oak front door, interrupting her complaints. I walked over and pulled the heavy door open. My building concierge stood there alongside 3 Miami police officers, looking grim and ready to de-escalate a volatile situation. Instantly, the family dynamic shifted. Brenda, who had been silently judging my expensive wine collection, activated her tears on command. She rushed forward, playing the role of the distraught matriarch to absolute perfection. Officer, thank goodness you are here, Brenda cried, clutching her chest dramatically. My daughter is having a severe mental breakdown. We came all the way down here to care for her, and she is trying to throw her heavily pregnant sister onto the street. She is completely unhinged and threatening us in our own family-leased home." The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, looked past her theatrics and locked eyes with me. "Ma'am, did you place the call regarding trespassers?" he asked. I did not say a word to my mother. I simply gave the officer a calm nod and walked across the living room toward a large custom canvas painting hanging on the far wall. The entire family watched me in utter silence, convinced I was retreating in defeat. I pushed the edge of the heavy frame, causing it to swing open on hidden hinges. Behind it sat a biometric wall safe. I pressed my thumb to the scanner and typed in my passcode. The heavy metallic click echoed sharply in the quiet room. I reached inside and extracted a thick embossed document encased in a protective leather folder. I walked back to the center of the room and dropped it directly onto the glass coffee table right next to my father's crumpled 5-year-old lease. "That is the certified property deed," I stated, my voice cutting through the tension like glass. "I purchased Penthouse 2300 outright 3 years ago through an anonymous LLC, which is legally registered to my name. I am the sole owner of this $4 million property. These people do not live here. They are not on any lease. They illegally copied a spare key to stage a home invasion. I want them removed from my property immediately." The lead officer picked up the heavy document scanning the official city seals and the clear legal phrasing that tied my name to the property. He looked at my father's expired lease still sitting on the table and let out a heavy sigh of exasperation. "Sir," the officer said, turning to Thomas, whose face had drained of all color, "you are trespassing. Gather your belongings and vacate the premises right now." Terrence stepped forward, his chest puffed out in sudden aggressive outrage. His calm entrepreneurial facade shattered instantly. "You cannot do this to us," he yelled, pointing an aggressive finger inches from my face. "We are family. You owe us this space, Madeline. You are not kicking my pregnant wife out." Terrence lunged forward, attempting to grab the property deed off the table. He never made it. The officers reacted with lightning speed. Before Terrence could even lay a hand on my documents, 2 officers tackled him against the wall. The sound of metal handcuffs clicking into place was the most satisfying noise I had heard all morning. Terrence struggled, cursing and shouting about his rights, but the officers held him in a firm, unyielding grip. "You are under arrest for aggressive trespassing and creating a disturbance," the officer informed him coldly. Thomas and Brenda were paralyzed with shock as they watched their golden son-in-law being forcibly restrained. Sydney began sobbing hysterically, clutching her stomach and screaming that I was a monster. "Get them out of my house," I instructed the concierge, who immediately signaled for building security to assist the remaining officers. Security guards grabbed the 5 massive suitcases and dragged them out into the corridor. The police firmly grabbed Thomas and Brenda by their arms, escorting them out of my pristine penthouse. As they were shoved into the hallway, Thomas twisted around, his face contorted with pure hatred. "You will pay for this, Madeline," he screamed, his voice echoing down the elegant corridor as the elevator doors opened. "You are dead to us. We will ruin you. You will regret the day you ever crossed this family." I stood in the doorway watching them being hauled away like common criminals. I did not blink. I reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and slammed my custom oak door shut, locking the deadbolt with a resounding click. The invasion was over, but I knew my family well enough to know the war had only just begun. The morning sun breached the floor-to-ceiling windows of Penthouse 2300, casting long, bright shadows across the living room where my family had attempted their pathetic coup just yesterday. My phone, vibrating intensely against the marble nightstand, woke me from a surprisingly deep sleep. It was barely 6 in the morning, but the screen was already illuminated with dozens of unread notifications. The retaliation had begun exactly as I anticipated. A quick check of the Miami-Dade County Online Inmate Registry confirmed what the barrage of messages already implied. Terrence had been bailed out sometime around midnight. Thomas and Brenda had wasted absolutely no time launching their counterattack. Instead of feeling an ounce of shame for breaking into my home, they took their fabricated grievances straight to the public. I opened Facebook and there it was, a massive, highly coordinated smear campaign plastered across my parents' timelines and shared indiscriminately across our entire extended family network. Brenda had posted a glowing, heavily filtered photograph of Sydney standing in front of my building, rubbing her pregnant belly while looking distressed. Below the image was a long, rambling paragraph of pure fiction. According to my mother's theatrical narrative, I was a heartless corporate monster consumed entirely by greed and status. She painted a tragic picture of Sydney and Terrence arriving in Miami, desperate for a safe haven for their unborn child, only to be cast out onto the dangerous streets by a cruel sister who cared more about her square footage than family blood. The post described my actions as a ruthless display of wealth meant to humiliate them in their time of need. There was zero mention of the stolen key, the forced entry, the expired lease, or Terrence's arrest. They had completely rewritten reality to cast themselves as the ultimate victims of my supposed malice. The flying monkeys descended with predictable ferocity. My phone was blowing up with toxic text messages, voicemails, and direct messages from relatives I had not spoken to in years. Aunt Carol sent a blistering paragraph accusing me of abandoning my flesh and blood, stating she was disgusted to share my last name. Cousin Mark left a slurring voicemail calling me an arrogant snob who forgot where she came from, and demanding I apologize to Sydney immediately. Uncle David sent a lengthy guilt-tripping email quoting scripture and demanding I surrender my guest room to make amends for my lack of charity. It was a digital assassination attempt designed to isolate me completely and pressure me into compliance through sheer communal shame. They expected me to cave under the weight of their collective disappointment. They expected me to call my mother crying, begging for forgiveness, and offering them the keys to my home just to avoid being shunned by the family tree. I did not shed a single tear. I did not type out an angry rebuttal or try to defend my character in the comments section. Arguing with committed victims is a fool's errand. I completely ignored the flying monkeys. I silenced my notifications, set my phone face down on the vanity, and walked into my bathroom to prepare for the workday. 45 minutes later, I stepped into my private elevator, wearing a tailored designer suit, feeling sharper and more focused than ever. I descended to the private parking garage, slid into the driver's seat of my car, and merged onto the bustling Miami streets, heading toward my corporate office. The tropical air was thick, but the interior of my car was cool and quiet, allowing me space to think. As I navigated the morning traffic, my mind drifted back to the harsh reality of how I built my life. The relatives sending me hateful messages from their couches had absolutely no idea what it took to climb to the pinnacle of the luxury event management industry. They did not see the years I spent surviving on cheap coffee and instant noodles, working 18-hour days to coordinate high-end charity galas and corporate summits. They were not around when I was maxing out my only credit card to print marketing materials, or when I was pitching my services to skeptical billionaires while wearing thrift store blazers. They did not witness the relentless networking, the sleepless nights, or the ruthless negotiations that transformed my tiny, struggling startup into a premier agency handling multi-million-dollar budgets. I had earned every single thing I owned through blood, sweat, and absolute grit. I never asked my parents for a dime. I built my empire with my own two hands. In stark contrast, there was Terrence. While I was building a legitimate enterprise brick by brick, my parents were busy draining their hard-earned retirement accounts to fund his endless string of failed startups. Terrence was always pitching the next big thing. A few years ago, it was a revolutionary cryptocurrency exchange that vanished overnight, taking thousands of my father's dollars with it. Then it was a tech incubator that never secured a single patent. After that came a fitness app that promised to disrupt the market, but failed to even launch because Terrence spent the development funds on a leased sports car and expensive dinners. Thomas and Brenda blindly threw their life savings at him, convinced he was a misunderstood genius who would eventually make them unbelievably rich. Thomas would proudly brag at Thanksgiving dinners about his son-in-law's visionary ideas while pointedly ignoring my growing business. They mortgaged their entire future on a man whose only real talent was talking gullible people out of their money. Now that their funds were entirely depleted and Terrence's latest venture had predictably collapsed, they needed a new host to drain. They looked at my success, my beautiful penthouse, and my financial stability, and decided it belonged to them. They thought a few angry Facebook posts and some family guilt would force me to open my doors and my wallet. I pulled into my reserved parking spot at my corporate headquarters, killed the engine, and took a deep breath. They could wage their digital war all they wanted. Let them spin their fairy tales on social media and gather sympathy from distant relatives who never bothered to check the facts. I grabbed my briefcase and stepped out of the car. I had a real business to run and absolutely no time to entertain their delusions. Stepping into the crisp, air-conditioned lobby of my firm, I left the digital noise of my family's smear campaign at the glass doors. I had a massive charity gala to execute this weekend for the Miami Children's Health Foundation, and there was absolutely no room for error. The stakes were astronomical. We were expecting 300 of the wealthiest philanthropists in South Florida, and my reputation as an elite event manager rested entirely on the flawless execution of this night. I breezed past my receptionist, grabbed my schedule, and walked straight into the main conference room where my top-tier vendors were already gathered. The energy in the room was electric but tense. Sitting around the long mahogany table were the city's premier florists, the head of a Michelin-starred catering company, and the director of a high-end audiovisual firm. We spent the next 2 hours meticulously reviewing every detail of the gala. We finalized the placement of the imported white orchids, confirmed the exact timing of the champagne service, and locked down the acoustic settings for the string quartet. Everything was proceeding perfectly. We had reached the final phase of the meeting, which was processing the remaining deposits required to secure the vendors for the weekend. I opened my leather folio and extracted my heavy metal corporate platinum card, sliding it across the polished table to Laurent, the head caterer. He was a notoriously strict professional who required absolute financial punctuality. He plugged his mobile payment terminal into his tablet and inserted my card. I continued discussing the lighting cues with the AV director while Laurent typed in the $50,000 deposit amount. A sharp, discordant beep interrupted the flow of conversation. Laurent frowned and tapped the screen a few times. He pulled the card out, wiped the chip on his sleeve, and inserted it again. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the conference room as another sharp beep echoed off the glass walls. Laurent looked up at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and professional concern. "Madeline, the terminal is saying the transaction is declined," he stated, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "It is instructing me to confiscate the card." A hot flash of humiliation spiked in my chest, but my face remained an unreadable mask. In my industry, projecting absolute financial stability is paramount. A declined card could instantly trigger a panic among vendors, potentially collapsing the entire event. I let out a light, practiced laugh, waving my hand dismissively. "You know how these banks are with fraud protection on large transactions," I said smoothly, projecting absolute confidence. "They always flag these sudden, high-dollar deposits right before a major event. Let me just step into my office and authorize the release with my wealth manager. I will be right back." I smiled at the room, picked up my phone and the confiscated card from Laurent, and walked out of the conference room with measured, unhurried steps. The moment my private office door clicked shut behind me, my calm facade dropped. My hands were shaking slightly as I dialed the direct line to my private banking representative. This card had no preset spending limit, and the operating account attached to it held more than enough liquid capital to cover the entire gala 3 times over. A decline of this nature was virtually impossible. A representative answered immediately, but the usual warm greeting was absent. When I provided my account details and security PIN, there was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. "Ms. Wilson, I am seeing a severe security lock on your entire profile," the representative said, his tone clipped and serious. "I cannot authorize any overrides from this department. I need to transfer you directly to our Federal Fraud Division. Please hold." The sterile instrumental hold music played for 3 excruciating minutes. I paced the length of my office, staring out at the ocean, trying to calculate what could have possibly gone wrong. Had my firm been hacked? Had a rogue vendor compromised our routing numbers? The music clicked off, and a new voice came on the line, identifying herself as an agent with the bank's Federal Monitoring Liaison Office. She asked me a series of intense security questions, verifying my identity through past addresses, previous tax filings, and mother's maiden name. Once she was satisfied I was actually Madeline Wilson, she delivered the news that completely pulled the floor out from under me. Your corporate card was not declined due to a simple fraud alert, Ms. Wilson. The agent explained, her voice grave. Your social security number and all associated corporate tax identification numbers have been flagged by federal banking monitors. As of 6 o'clock this morning, your entire financial portfolio, both personal and business, has been completely frozen. I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles turning white. Frozen. I repeated the word, barely making sense. What do you mean, frozen? I have legitimate vendor payments that must be cleared today. I have payroll. I have a multi-million-dollar charity gala this weekend. I understand the urgency, the agent replied, but our hands are tied by federal mandate. Our systems detected a massive anomaly initiated late last night. Someone utilizing your exact credentials, your social security number, your personal financial history, and the asset portfolio of your event management firm, initiated a shadow mortgage application for $3 million. The air vanished from my lungs. $3 million. I had not applied for any loans, let alone a massive commercial mortgage. I asked the agent to explain exactly what a shadow mortgage was. She calmly detailed that it was a highly sophisticated, fraudulent application designed to bypass standard verification checks, often utilizing shell companies and rushed processing fees to push massive loans through alternative lending syndicates before the primary victim even realized their identity had been compromised. Because the application was so large and tied to both your personal identity and your corporate entity, the federal monitors triggered an immediate total asset freeze to prevent the funds from being dispersed. She continued, until this fraudulent application is investigated and cleared by the authorities, you will not be able to access your checking accounts, your savings, your investment portfolios, or any credit lines attached to your name. You effectively have zero purchasing power. I stood in my office completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the disaster. My vendors were sitting 20 feet away, waiting for their money. If I could not pay them, the gala would be canceled. If the gala was canceled, my reputation would be permanently destroyed, and my firm would face catastrophic lawsuits. I was entirely locked out of my own life. Everything I had built, everything I had worked for, was suddenly trapped behind a federal firewall. I ended the call mechanically, staring at the blank screen of my phone as the terrifying reality set in. I had no access to a single dollar to my name. I stared at the blank screen of my phone as the terrifying reality set in. I had no access to a single dollar to my name. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to slow. Panic is a luxury I could not afford. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer, squared my shoulders, and walked back into the main conference room. The vendors looked up expectantly, waiting for their deposits. I offered them a practiced apologetic smile. I informed them that my corporate banking liaison had flagged a routing error during a scheduled security update. I assured Laurent and the others that my chief financial officer would manually wire the deposits first thing tomorrow morning, directly from our reserve accounts. Because of my flawless track record and years of prompt payments, they accepted the explanation without a single note of suspicion. They packed up their thick portfolios, shook my hand, and exited through the glass doors. I was safe for exactly 24 hours before my event empire would begin to crack. The moment the office was clear, I locked the conference room doors and sprinted to my private desk. I booted up my secure encrypted workstation. Working in high-end event management meant dealing with international clients, shell corporations, and high-net-worth individuals who demanded extreme discretion. Over the years, I had built a formidable network of private investigators, forensic accountants, and cybersecurity experts to vet potential clients before signing contracts. I immediately bypassed the standard banking channels and logged into a proprietary background check database my firm used for extreme corporate vetting. I keyed in my own social security number and pulled the deep credit inquiry logs. The federal agent had mentioned a shadow mortgage, and I needed to see exactly who was making the back-end queries on my identity. The database churned for a few agonizing seconds before spitting out a heavily redacted application file. The massive commercial loan request had been routed through a newly formed entity called Apex Horizon Holdings. It sounded like a generic investment group designed to deflect attention, but I knew exactly how to dig deeper. I pulled the state corporate registry records for Apex Horizon Holdings. The company had been incorporated less than a month ago. The registered agent was a generic legal service out of Delaware, but the secondary mailing address listed on the incorporation documents made the blood in my veins run freezing cold. It was a modest residential address in a suburb just north of Miami, the exact address of my parents' house. Terrence was the listed managing director. The sheer audacity of the scheme snapped into sharp crystalline focus. Terrence had not just stolen my identity to secure a fraudulent $3 million loan. He had weaponized my own family against me to execute it. Suddenly, the bizarre, aggressive events of yesterday morning took on a sinister new meaning. The hostile invasion of my home was never simply about providing my pregnant sister with a luxurious place to live. It was a highly calculated strategic maneuver. Terrence and Thomas desperately needed to establish physical residency at Penthouse 2300 to legitimize the fake mortgage documents. In the murky world of shadow lending, shady underwriters required ironclad proof of occupancy. They needed Terrence and Sydney physically inside the penthouse to sign the final disbursement papers, receive the fraudulent mail, or greet a corrupt appraiser. That was why they brought 5 massive suitcases. That was why Terrence immediately tried to claim my living room as his corporate hub and why Thomas flashed a fake lease at the police. If the authorities had not dragged them out yesterday, they would have cemented their physical presence just long enough for the $3 million to hit Terrence's offshore accounts. I had thwarted their physical infiltration, but the digital bomb was still ticking loudly in the background. As I sat in the silent glow of my computer monitors processing the true depth of their betrayal, my cell phone buzzed violently against the mahogany desk. The caller ID displayed Terrence's number. I did not answer. It buzzed again, and then a long text message illuminated the lock screen. I picked up the device and read the words that were deliberately designed to destroy my life. The message was dripping with unearned arrogance. Terrence openly admitted to initiating the shadow loan. He stated that the fraudulent paperwork was already circulating through back-channel lenders, and the funds were primed and ready to clear. He laid out a brutal, uncompromising ultimatum. I had exactly 12 hours to call the Miami police and drop all trespassing charges against him. Furthermore, I was strictly ordered to sign a quitclaim deed, transferring ownership of Penthouse 2300 directly to Sydney. If I complied, he promised he would cancel the shadow loan application and disappear. If I refused, he would push the final authorization through. He gleefully pointed out that because the loan was initiated with my exact biometric data and tax records, the federal government would automatically assume I was the one committing the crime. He promised that my stellar credit would be permanently destroyed, my event management business would be seized by federal agents, and I would be the one facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud. Terrence ended the message with a chilling reminder that family requires sacrifice, and it was time for me to pay my dues. He thought he had me completely trapped in an inescapable corner. He genuinely believed that the threat of federal prison and total financial ruin would force me to surrender my home and drop the criminal charges that were currently keeping his passport flagged. He assumed I would panic, break down, and surrender everything I had built just to save my own skin. He completely underestimated my resolve. I did not hurl my phone across the room or scream into the empty office. I sat back in my leather chair and read the extortion message a second time, committing every word to memory. Terrence had just handed me a written digital confession to federal extortion, wire fraud, and identity theft. The arrogant predator thought he held the execution code, but he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to dismantle him entirely. I stared at the digital confession glowing on my screen. Any amateur would have bolted straight to the local police precinct, waving the text message as proof of extortion. I knew better. In the realm of high-level financial fraud, a single digital message sent from a burner application or a spoofed number could easily be contested by a halfway decent defense attorney. Terrence would simply claim his phone was hacked or deny sending the message altogether, dragging me into a protracted, he said she said legal battle, while my assets remained locked in federal purgatory. If I was going to sever this toxic branch of my family tree permanently, I needed a titanium case. I needed an irrefutable paper trail that tracked every single fraudulent keystroke back to his exact IP address and undeniably linked Thomas to the conspiracy. I unlocked a hidden drawer in my mahogany desk and retrieved a secure encrypted smartphone reserved exclusively for my most sensitive corporate communications. I dialed a number I had only utilized once before during a hostile corporate takeover. It belonged to Marcus Vance, a former Treasury Department agent who now ran the most elite private forensic financial investigation firm in South Florida. Marcus did not advertise, and he certainly did not come cheap. He catered exclusively to high-net-worth individuals whose crises required absolute discretion and surgical precision. When he answered on the second ring, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I laid out the exact parameters of the shadow mortgage the shell company registered to my parents' residential address and the blackmail text currently sitting on my personal device. Marcus grasped the severity of the federal monitor freeze instantly. He demanded unrestricted access to my corporate servers and 48 hours to deploy his team of digital bloodhounds. They would trace the origin of the $3 million loan application, unearth the back-channel lenders Terrence was using, and secure the metadata proving my family was actively attempting to defraud a federal institution. I wired his exorbitant retainer from an offline contingency account that my family knew absolutely nothing about. With Marcus hunting down the digital fingerprints, I needed to buy him the 48 hours he requested. The only way to stall a desperate narcissist is to feed their ego until they are bloated with false confidence. Terrence and Thomas expected me to crumble. They anticipated a hysterical weeping woman terrified of losing her freedom and her hard-earned fortune. I decided to give them exactly the performance they demanded. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my blazer, and practiced my best submissive, panicked expression in the reflection of the glass conference table. I had spent my entire adolescence shrinking myself to avoid my father's wrath. Slipping back into the role of the obedient, frightened daughter was dangerously easy, but this time I was the director of the play. I picked up my everyday phone and navigated to my text thread with Thomas. Contacting Terrence directly would validate his unearned sense of authority and tip him off that I saw him as a legitimate threat. Thomas was the true patriarch of this delusion, and massaging his patriarchal ego was the quickest route to securing a delay. My fingers flew across the keyboard, crafting a message dripping with manufactured panic and utter defeat. "Dad, please tell Terrence to stop the loan application," I typed, ensuring my punctuation mirrored the frantic energy of a cornered animal. "The bank just told me the federal monitors are watching my social security number. I am terrified of going to prison for fraud." "You win. I will drop the charges and sign whatever Sydney needs for the penthouse. Just please call this off before I lose everything." I hit send and watched the read receipt register almost immediately. I could practically picture Thomas sitting in whatever cheap motel room they were occupying since their dramatic eviction, puffing out his chest with absolute triumph. He had successfully broken his defiant, independent daughter and brought her back to heel. He was undoubtedly showing the message to Brenda, letting her bask in the glorious defeat of my boundaries. Several agonizing minutes passed while he deliberated on the most condescending way to accept my unconditional surrender. The screen finally lit up with his response. "We always knew you would eventually see reason." Madeline, his text read, dripping with paternal condescension. Family is not something you can just lock out of a penthouse when it becomes inconvenient. We will discuss the transfer of the deed and the immediate dismissal of your ridiculous trespassing charges against your brother-in-law in person. We are not doing this over the phone. I immediately replied, agreeing to his demand for a face-to-face negotiation. I asked him where he wanted to meet, playing the role of the contrite host willing to accommodate his schedule. I fully expected him to choose a quiet coffee shop, or perhaps demand access to my corporate office to gloat in front of my staff while issuing his demands. I severely underestimated his insatiable need for theatrical dominance and public humiliation. Thomas sent an address for El Oceanaire, an ultra-exclusive Michelin-starred seafood establishment located right in the heart of Miami's financial district. It was notoriously difficult to secure a reservation there, requiring weeks of advance notice or significant industry connections. Thomas had undoubtedly name-dropped my event management firm and utilized my corporate reputation to bully the maitre d' into securing a prime table for the evening. He chose the most expensive, highly visible restaurant in the city to publicly flaunt his perceived victory over me. He wanted me to sit submissively and hand over the deed to my $4 million property while he dined on imported caviar billed directly to my tab. I confirmed the time and locked the phone, feeling a cold smile touch my lips. Thomas thought the Michelin-starred dining room would be the stage for his ultimate triumph. He assumed the expensive, intimidating ambiance would force me to quietly sign away my life without causing a scene. He had absolutely no idea he was merely walking into a meticulously constructed trap while Marcus Vance and his team of digital executioners gathered the final undeniable nails for his coffin. The maitre d' at El Oceanaire glided across the Italian marble floor, leading me toward a secluded VIP alcove framed by cascading velvet curtains and a wall of illuminated vintage wines. The air smelled of truffles and roasted garlic, cut with the crisp salinity of fresh oysters. I maintained my perfectly tailored expression of wide-eyed anxiety as I approached the table. Thomas, Terrence, Sydney, and Brenda were already seated, and they had wasted absolutely no time indulging in the illusion of my surrendered wealth. Two-tiered towers of chilled seafood, rare beluga caviar, and an open bottle of vintage champagne crowded the white linen tablecloth. Terrence sat back with his suit jacket unbuttoned, looking entirely too relaxed for a man who had spent the previous morning in handcuffs. Thomas wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and gestured toward the empty chair opposite him. He did not offer a greeting. He simply adopted the stern, disappointed posture of a patriarch burdened by a disobedient child. He snapped his fingers at a passing waiter, ordering a sparkling water for me, before returning his heavy gaze to my face. He wanted to set the tone immediately. He needed to establish absolute dominance in this opulent setting. "We are only going to say this once," Madeline Thomas began, his voice pitched low to ensure the neighboring tables could not hear the extortion taking place. "You have put yourself in a catastrophic position. I spoke with my contacts in the financial sector. Federal monitors do not just freeze portfolios over simple accounting errors. You have engaged in highly illegal wire fraud, and now the government is preparing to seize everything you own. You are facing decades in a federal penitentiary." He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and withdrew a thick, stapled legal document. He slid it across the table until it rested directly in front of my empty plate. It was not a simple quitclaim deed for the penthouse. The bold, bolded letters across the top identified it as a comprehensive and irrevocable power of attorney. "I am willing to step in and shield you from the fallout," Thomas continued, leaning forward and steepling his fingers. "But I cannot do that while you remain the sole signatory on your accounts. You are going to sign this document transferring full administrative and executive control of your personal assets and your corporate entity over to Terrence. He knows how to navigate complex financial restructuring. He will interface with the banks quietly, liquidate the necessary assets, and make this federal investigation disappear before you end up in handcuffs. All you have to do is sign." Sydney took a delicate sip of her vibrant pink mocktail and let out a soft, condescending sigh. She placed both hands over her pronounced stomach, rubbing it with exaggerated maternal concern. Honestly, Madeline, you should be thanking us, she chimed in, her tone dripping with false pity. You are a single woman in your 30s. What do you even need a financial empire and a $4 million penthouse for? It is completely selfish to hoard that kind of wealth when you have no real family to pass it on to. You are alone. This baby needs a legacy and a secure future. You signing this document is the only way to prove you actually care about the bloodline. I kept my hands neatly folded in my lap, keeping my breathing shallow to mimic genuine panic. Beneath the table, the encrypted burner phone tucked into the pocket of my trousers vibrated sharply. Marcus Vance was exactly on time. I subtly shifted my weight, slipping my hand down to tap the screen open while pretending to adjust my posture. The message from my elite forensic investigator was concise, brutal, and entirely illuminating. Terrence was not just a failed entrepreneur. He was completely and entirely bankrupt. His last cryptocurrency venture had not merely collapsed due to market fluctuations. Marcus uncovered that Terrence had secured his seed capital from a highly dangerous offshore private lending syndicate notorious for their violent debt collection methods. Terrence owed them exactly $3.2 million. The shadow mortgage application for $3 million was not a play to get rich. It was a desperate, frantic scramble to pay off a lethal debt before the syndicate came to collect his life. But the second part of Marcus' message was the true bombshell. Terrence had not secured that initial dangerous loan on his own. He lacked the collateral. Thomas had secretly cross-collateralized his own primary residence, the house I grew up in, to back Terrence's debt. The syndicate held a hidden lien on my parents' property. If Terrence did not deliver the $3 million by the end of the month, Thomas and Brenda would not just be publicly humiliated. They would be entirely homeless, left destitute on the street, while violent creditors dismantled their golden son-in-law. The pieces snapped together, forming a crystal-clear picture of pure, unadulterated desperation. The arrogant sneers on their faces were nothing but a fragile mask hiding absolute terror. They were not sitting across from me as conquerors. They were cornered, drowning animals thrashing wildly to pull me under so they could use my body as a raft. They needed my penthouse and my corporate accounts to save their own lives. The feigned anxiety completely drained from my body, replaced by a surge of cold, calculated power. I looked up from my lap and met my father's gaze. The dynamic at the table shifted instantly as the terrified daughter vanished. I did not reach for the pen, resting beside the power of attorney. You actually believe I am stupid enough to sign my life away to a man who owes $3 million to a cartel? I asked, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper. Terrence's smug expression evaporated instantly. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly in the warm restaurant lighting. Thomas stiffened his hands, gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles popped. Brenda let out a small, strangled gasp. I know exactly who holds the lien on your house, Dad. I continued, relishing the absolute panic blooming in his eyes. I know exactly why you are trying to frame me for a shadow mortgage. You are not trying to save me. You are trying to buy your own lives with my money. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The arrogant patriarch was entirely paralyzed by the sudden violent exposure of his darkest secret. Sydney stopped rubbing her belly, her hand frozen in place as she stared at her husband in rising horror. I slowly unclasped my designer handbag and reached inside. I pulled out a crisp, fresh $100 bill. I leaned forward and dropped it precisely onto the center of the fraudulent power of attorney covering the signature line. That is for the sparkling water, I stated, my tone echoing with finality. I highly recommend you enjoy the caviar while you still have a roof over your heads. I stood up, turned my back on their shattered table, and walked out of the opulent dining room. The sharp, rhythmic click of my heels on the marble floor was the only sound accompanying my exit. I did not look back. I had just backed 4 desperate, starving wolves into an inescapable corner, and I knew exactly what they would be forced to do next. They had no choice but to escalate, and I was completely ready for their final fatal mistake. The 48 hours following my exit from the restaurant required military-level precision. Thanks to Marcus Vance tracking the digital breadcrumbs and my loyal chief financial officer manually pushing the vendor wires from an isolated reserve account, The federal freeze became nothing more than a silent background issue. The event itself was a masterpiece of luxury coordination. The grand ballroom of the oceanfront resort was transformed into a breathtaking, luminescent paradise. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded from the vaulted ceilings, catching the light of custom crystal chandeliers. The room was packed with over 300 of South Florida's most powerful figures. Billionaire tech moguls, real estate tycoons, and international philanthropists mingled over flutes of vintage champagne and plates of truffle-infused hors d'oeuvres. I stood on the mezzanine level overlooking the expansive floor, a discreet earpiece secured directing the flow of the evening like a symphony conductor. I was entirely in my element, ensuring every lighting cue was precise and every high-net-worth donor was accommodated. The adrenaline of executing a flawless high-stakes event had pushed the restaurant confrontation to the back of my mind. I had fortified the perimeter of the gala with an elite private security firm. The guest list was tightly controlled with dual authentication check-ins and armed guards stationed at every official entryway. I assumed the sheer exclusivity of the venue would keep my desperate relatives at bay. I severely underestimated the dangerous ingenuity of a cornered animal. Terrence was a failed entrepreneur, but he understood the mechanics of corporate loopholes. Marcus had previously warned me that Terrence possessed high-grade commercial printing equipment, the exact hardware utilized to fabricate his shadow mortgage documents. Sometime during the afternoon, Terrence had leveraged that equipment to forge 4 flawless all-access vendor credentials. They bypassed the heavily fortified front entrance and slipped through the chaotic loading docks, blending in with the temporary catering staff during the dinner service transition. I was coordinating the movement of the silent auction items when a sharp transmission crackled through my earpiece. The head of my security detail reported an anomaly near the East Wing service doors. Before I could instruct him to lock down the corridor, the heavy mahogany doors of the main ballroom swung open. My heart turned to ice. Thomas, Brenda, Sydney, and Terrence marched directly into the center of the opulent room. They stuck out immediately among the sea of custom tuxedos and haute couture gowns. Terrence was wearing an ill-fitting suit, looking sweaty and frantic. Thomas had a grim, furious determination plastered across his face. Brenda was already adopting a tragic, tearful posture, while Sydney clutched her pregnant belly as if it were a prop in a terrible stage play. They had infiltrated the most important night of my professional career with one singular objective. They intended to create a catastrophic public scandal. Their strategy was a kamikaze tactic of extortion through social destruction. They knew my elite clients demanded absolute discretion and flawless execution. A screaming match in the middle of a multi-million-dollar charity event would permanently brand my firm as a liability. They planned to hold my entire corporate future hostage. They calculated that if they caused a massive hysterical scene in front of Miami's elite investors, I would panic drag them into a VIP suite and sign whatever documents they demanded just to silence them. I did not panic. I tapped my earpiece, instructing the head of my private security detail to stand down but remain within an invisible 20-foot perimeter. I glided down the sweeping marble staircase, navigating the sea of silk and diamonds with practiced ease. I intercepted the hostile quartet near the towering ice sculpture at the edge of the room, effectively blocking their path to the main stage. Thomas stepped forward, his chest puffed out, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. He smelled of cheap scotch and stale sweat, a sharp contrast to the wealthy donors surrounding us. "You thought you could walk away from us at the restaurant," Thomas hissed, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of rage and terror. "You are going to take us to a private office right now. You are going to sign the asset transfer. If you do not comply immediately, your mother is going to walk straight up to that microphone and tell every single investor in this room that you abandoned your pregnant sister to save a few dollars. We will make you the most despised woman in Miami." Brenda activated her tears on command, letting out a loud theatrical sob that drew the attention of a nearby hedge fund manager. "I will scream it to the heavens, Madeline," she whispered maliciously. "I will fall to my knees and beg these people to help my poor homeless daughter." Your reputation will not survive the night. Sydney leaned heavily against a display table, groaning loudly, to draw more eyes to our corner of the room. Terence hovered nervously behind them, clutching a leather folder containing the identical fraudulent power of attorney I had left at the restaurant. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. The private lending syndicate's deadline was clearly closing in, and the sheer terror radiating from him was palpable. I looked at the four people who shared my DNA and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. They were threatening to sabotage a charity event designed to fund pediatric oncology wings, just to save themselves from a violent loan shark they had willingly partnered with. They were weaponizing public shame, fully convinced that I was still the eager-to-please daughter who would crumble at the mere thought of embarrassing the family tree. They had cornered me in a room full of billionaires, banking on my fear of losing everything I had built. They wanted a public spectacle, and as I looked into my father's desperate eyes, I realized I was more than willing to give them exactly what they asked for. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, away from the ice sculpture, clearing the invisible perimeter between my family and the grand ballroom. Brenda mistook my silent withdrawal for fearful hesitation. Believing she had successfully paralyzed me with the threat of social ruin, she seized her moment. She broke away from Thomas and marched directly toward a cluster of high-profile real estate developers and venture capitalists I had been speaking with earlier in the evening. She did not just raise her voice to cause a scene. She threw her entire body into a masterful display of weaponized victimhood. Brenda collapsed onto the polished Italian marble floor right in the center of the main thoroughfare. Her knees struck the stone with a loud crack, and she immediately buried her face in her hands, letting out a piercing, hysterical scream. The sheer volume of her wailing sliced through the elegant ambient noise of the gala like a siren. She threw her head back, ensuring the crystal chandelier light illuminated her tear-streaked face, and began screaming at the top of her lungs. "She is a monster!" Brenda wailed, pointing a trembling finger back at me while clutching the fabric of her dress. "My own flesh and blood is a monster. She is a financial fraud, a corporate predator, who is hiding millions of dollars in stolen money while leaving her own family to starve on the streets. We have nothing. She evicted her pregnant sister to protect her illegal empires." The physical shockwave of her outburst rippled across the ballroom. Waiters froze mid-stride, champagne flutes hovering precariously on silver trays. The elite donors, hedge fund managers, tech billionaires, and international politicians stopped their conversations instantly. The string quartet positioned on the elevated stage faltered. The cellist missed a note, the violinist lowered his bow, and within seconds, the music died completely. The sudden absence of the classical score made the ballroom feel cavernous and terrifyingly quiet. Without the background music, every single word Brenda shrieked echoed off the vaulted ceilings, amplifying the scandal to every corner of the venue. Seeing that Brenda had successfully commanded the absolute attention of Miami's wealthiest elite, Terence realized it was his cue. He stepped squarely into the spotlight, puffing out his chest, to assume the role of the righteous, protective patriarch. He marched forward, placing himself between Brenda's sobbing form and the stunned crowd, acting as a human shield against my supposed tyranny. He raised his voice, projecting to the VIP balconies and the reserved donor tables, ensuring his slander reached maximum capacity. "Do not listen to a word she says!" Terence bellowed, sweeping his arm toward me with theatrical disgust. "Madeline is running a massive criminal enterprise right under your noses. She is smiling in your faces and taking your charity donations while orchestrating high-level wire fraud. She has been funneling illicit funds through shell companies and stealing from her own family's estates to fund this glamorous lifestyle." He held up the leather folder containing the fabricated power of attorney, waving it in the air like a smoking gun. "I have the documents right here." He lied loudly, his voice echoing across the silent marble room. "I have the proof of her shadow mortgages and her offshore accounts." She thought she could silence us. She thought she could threaten us with her private security and throw us out onto the street to keep her dirty secrets buried. But I will not let her defraud the good people in this room. I am prepared to hand everything over to the SEC and the FBI tonight unless she faces justice right here. Sydney moved to support the offensive, leaning heavily against a high-top cocktail table draped in white linen. She pressed both hands to her pregnant belly, weeping loudly and shaking her head. She looked at a nearby tech CEO with wide, tear-filled eyes, whispering loudly about how she just wanted a safe place for her baby to sleep. Thomas stood behind them all, an imposing figure of manufactured sorrow. He looked down at the floor, shaking his head slowly, as if he were a broken, heartbroken father who could no longer protect the world from his daughter's villainy. They formed a flawless, tragic tableau of victims entirely united in their performance. The atmosphere in this grand ballroom became suffocatingly tense. Hundreds of eyes shifted from the weeping family on the floor directly to me. The silence was absolute, broken only by Brenda's theatrical sobs and the occasional clink of a glass being set down nervously. I saw elite investors exchanging sharp, wide-eyed glances. I saw phones being subtly pulled out from velvet clutches recording the spectacle. The private security detail I had hired shifted their weight, their hands hovering near their earpieces, waiting for my strict command to physically drag the intruders out of the building. Terrence locked eyes with me across the expanse of the floor, breathing heavily. His entire posture demanded my immediate surrender. He expected me to shatter under the crushing weight of public humiliation. He calculated that I would be so terrified of my elite investors pulling their funding and blacklisting my firm that I would rush forward, grab his arm, and beg him to step into a private VIP suite. He firmly believed I would sign that fraudulent document and hand over my $4 million penthouse just to make the screaming stop and salvage my corporate reputation. I did not flinch. I did not cower or rush forward to silence them. I stood perfectly still on the edge of the marble staircase, absorbing the heavy, judgmental stares of my most lucrative clients. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the tension to become almost unbearable. I let Terrence hold his fake documents in the air. I let Brenda ruin her makeup on the cold floor. They thought they had trapped me in a brilliant ambush, but they had merely walked blindly onto a stage I fully controlled. They had given me the exact audience I needed to dismantle them permanently. I slowly reached into the pocket of my blazer and pressed the transmission button on my secure radio, linking me directly to the audio engineer in the master sound booth above the ballroom. I whispered the execution command into the concealed microphone secured near the lapel of my blazer. Instantly, the master control booth high above the ballroom floor responded to my directive. The three colossal 50-foot LED projection screens flanking the main stage, which had been displaying the shimmering gold and white logo of my philanthropic foundation, flickered and went entirely dark. A collective gasp rippled through the opulent ballroom as the brilliant ambient lighting abruptly shifted. A second later, the massive screens blazed back to life, illuminating the entire hall with stark, high-definition reality. I had instructed Marcus and his forensic team to prepare this exact visual contingency. Standing 50 feet tall were heavily redacted but undeniably authentic copies of Terrence's catastrophic financial history. Chapter 7. Bankruptcy filings, default notices, and the fraudulent shadow mortgage application, with its glaringly obvious digital discrepancies, were projected for every billionaire in Miami to analyze. The sudden violent shift in the room's focal point completely derailed Brenda's manufactured hysteria. Her piercing sobs sputtered out as she looked up at the glowing, undeniable evidence of their absolute ruin. I did not waste a single second of the momentum shift. I walked briskly past their frozen, terrified group, ascended the marble steps to the main stage, and unclipped the microphone from the clear acrylic podium. The audio feedback whined sharply for a fraction of a second, snapping the attention of every hedge fund manager, real estate mogul, and tech titan directly to me. Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for this unscripted interruption to our evening. I announced, my voice echoing with crisp, commanding authority over the state-of-the-art sound system. What you are witnessing on the floor tonight is not a family crisis. It is a masterclass in financial desperation. I gestured toward the colossal screens looming behind me. The man currently standing on the floor attempting to disrupt this gala is my brother-in-law Terrence. He is not a victim. He is a completely bankrupt amateur grifter who currently owes over $3 million to a highly dangerous private lending syndicate. A low murmur swept through the crowd of elite investors. These were individuals who built empires and dismantled hostile corporate takeovers before breakfast. They immediately recognized the anatomy of a pathetic con. In a frantic attempt to save his own life from violent offshore creditors, I continued pacing the stage with predatory grace. He attempted to weaponize my corporate identity to secure a fraudulent shadow loan. And the man standing behind him, my father, secretly cross-collateralized his own primary residence to back that toxic debt. They infiltrated this charity event tonight, hoping that the threat of a public scandal would force me to quietly sign away my assets to cover their catastrophic gambling debts. I looked down at Terrence, whose face had drained of all color, replacing his smug arrogance with a sickly, terrified pallor. I delivered the final crushing blow to his ego. They banked on the assumption that I would be intimidated by their presence in this room. But as anyone in my investment portfolio can attest, I do not negotiate with financial terrorists, and I certainly do not subsidize amateur hour. The tension in the grand ballroom held for one breathless moment before the reaction hit. It did not come in the form of shock or outrage directed at me. It came as a low, dismissive chuckle from a prominent venture capitalist standing near the front row. The amusement was highly contagious. Within seconds, the room full of Miami's most ruthless billionaires began to laugh. It was a tidal wave of pure, unfiltered mockery. They pointed at the massive screens, scoffing at the glaring errors in the projected loan documents, and shaking their heads at the sheer, unadulterated stupidity of bringing a low-level grift into a room full of apex predators. For extreme narcissists like Thomas and Terrence, who fed entirely on perceived dominance and respect, the mocking laughter of the elite class was a fate far worse than death. The profound public humiliation completely broke Terrence's fragile, inflated ego. His eyes darted frantically around the room, realizing that his reputation was permanently incinerated, and his lethal syndicate debt was now a matter of public mockery. His face turned a dangerous, mottled crimson. He dropped his leather folder, letting the fabricated power of attorney spill onto the floor, and let out a feral, unhinged roar. Losing all semblance of sanity, he put his head down and lunged toward the stage, charging directly at me with violent, desperate intent. He did not even make it to the bottom step. The invisible security perimeter I had established snapped shut like a steel trap. 3 heavily armored private contractors materialized from the crowd, moving with terrifying synchronized efficiency. They hit Terrence simultaneously before he could even register their presence. The impact was brutal. They drove him face first into the polished Italian marble floor with a sickening thud that echoed over the lingering laughter of the crowd. One contractor pinned Terrence's legs, while the other 2 drove their knees into his spine, swiftly twisting his arms behind his back and securing his wrists with heavy-duty zip ties in a matter of seconds. Terrence thrashed and screamed obscenities, but he was completely neutralized, pinned beneath 200 pounds of tactical muscle. Brenda shrieked in genuine horror as the guards hoisted Terrence upward by his bound arms, his ill-fitting suit ruined, and his nose bleeding onto the pristine floor. 2 more security guards flanked Sydney and Brenda, forcibly maneuvering them toward the service exit. Thomas realized his entire world was collapsing. His house was gone. His golden son-in-law was heading to a jail cell, and his ultimate attempt to subjugate his defiant daughter had ended in catastrophic public ruin. Stripped of all his patriarchal authority, he entirely lost his mind. As the security team physically dragged the thrashing group toward the heavy wooden doors, Thomas dug his heels in and screamed over the noise of the ballroom. His face was contorted with absolute venomous desperation. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at me as he was hauled backward. "We are taking you to court on Friday," Thomas roared, his voice cracking with frantic hysteria. "I have your signature on the power of attorney." The echo of Thomas's desperate, frantic threat hung in the humid night air long after the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom had slammed shut behind him. The promise of a Friday court battle was intended to strike absolute terror into my heart, a final desperate clawing for control as his extortion plot publicly collapsed. But as I stood on the gala stage looking out at the sea of amused investors returning to their champagne, I felt nothing but a cold, clinical anticipation. The 48 hours between the charity event and the hearing passed with surgical efficiency. I did not waste a single second worrying about their next move. I knew exactly what they were going to do, and I prepared for it. Friday morning dawned with blinding Florida sunshine casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across the wide concrete steps of the Miami-Dade Civil Courthouse. The sterile, heavily policed atmosphere of the legal district was a sharp departure from the imported orchids and custom lighting of Wednesday night. But to me, it was simply another arena. I sat quietly at the heavy oak defense table inside courtroom 4B, dressed in a flawless charcoal-tailored suit, my posture impeccable. Beside me sat Arthur Sterling, the most ruthless and expensive corporate litigator Marcus Vance had on his elite roster. We were a silent, unmovable front waiting for the circus to arrive. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a dramatic creak. Thomas and Sydney strutted down the center aisle, practically radiating a toxic, intoxicating cocktail of arrogance and manufactured victimhood. Thomas marched with his chest puffed out, wearing a freshly pressed navy suit that was meant to project respectability, looking every bit the triumphant patriarch marching in to claim his rightful spoils. Sydney waddled purposefully beside him, clutching her pregnant belly with both hands, her face arranged in a carefully rehearsed mask of long-suffering martyrdom. They were accompanied by a man who looked exactly like the kind of legal representation you could hire from a late-night television billboard. Their attorney, a slick, fast-talking man named Leonard, wore a gray suit that was just a shade too shiny under the fluorescent lights, and a heavy application of cologne that preceded him by several feet. He carried a battered leather briefcase and wore a massive, self-satisfied grin. Leonard strutted to the plaintiff's table, unpacking his files with exaggerated sweeping motions, clearly believing he was about to secure the easiest and most lucrative payday of his highly questionable career. Judge Eleanor Hastings, a veteran of the civil circuit with a notorious reputation for having zero tolerance regarding courtroom theatrics, took the bench. She adjusted her reading glasses, looking down at the morning docket with a deep frown. Leonard did not waste a single second. The moment he was formally permitted to speak, he launched into a deeply embellished, highly theatrical opening statement. He paced the well of the courtroom, waving his hands and projecting his voice as if playing to a packed jury box, entirely ignoring the fact that this was a private civil hearing. Your Honor. Leonard began, his voice dripping with a thick, artificial sincerity. We are here today to rectify a grievous breach of contract and a shocking display of familial betrayal. My client, Thomas, is a hard-working, dedicated father who found himself in a temporary but severe financial bind. Recognizing his deep distress, his wealthy, highly successful daughter, the defendant willingly and legally executed a comprehensive power of attorney. She explicitly authorized him to leverage her personal assets to secure a critical $3 million commercial loan to save the family from ruin. Leonard dramatically unclasped his briefcase and pulled out a crisp, white document, enclosed in a heavy plastic protective sleeve. He brandished it in the air like a winning lottery ticket. We possess the original signed and notarized document right here. It is indisputable physical proof of her consent. He handed the folder to the bailiff, who carried it up to the elevated bench. Thomas shot a triumphant, sneering glance in my direction. He genuinely believed he had won. He sat back in his chair, crossing his arms, utterly convinced that the mere presence of my signature, however it was obtained or fabricated, was the ultimate, inescapable checkmate. Leonard leaned heavily against the plaintiff's table, pointing an accusing finger toward Arthur and me. Your Honor. The defendant realized that her father's loan was nearing default and decided to maliciously renege on her legal obligations. She is attempting to hide behind her expensive corporate lawyers to avoid honoring a binding written agreement. My clients are facing immediate catastrophic financial ruin, while the defendant sits comfortably in a luxury oceanfront penthouse. We are demanding that the court enforce this power of attorney immediately. We formally petition for an emergency injunction to compel the immediate transfer of the deed for Penthouse 2300 into my client's name, allowing the property to be legally liquidated to satisfy the $3 million debt she fully authorized. To emphasize the absolute desperation of their stakes, Sydney let out a loud shuddering sigh, shifting her weight awkwardly in her chair and leaning heavily against Thomas. She was playing the pregnant about-to-be-homeless daughter card to the absolute hilt, hoping to sway the judge's emotional compass. Thomas wrapped a fiercely protective arm around her shoulders, looking up at the bench with a look of desperate, honest pleading. "We just want what she promised us. Your Honor." Thomas spoke out of turn, his voice trembling perfectly on cue. "We just want our family to survive this terrible ordeal." Judge Hastings ignored the emotional outburst, adjusting her glasses as she scrutinized the document before her. From where I sat, I could clearly see the ink strokes on the page. It was a masterpiece of criminal forgery. Terrence's commercial printing equipment and whatever desperate tracing methods they had utilized had produced a signature that was virtually indistinguishable from my own. The loops, the specific pressure points, the sharp, distinct angle of the first letter, it was a flawless replication. If this had been a standard contract dispute, that single piece of paper might have been enough to freeze my assets for months during a protracted, draining legal battle. Leonard stood tall, buttoning his shiny jacket with a look of supreme confidence. The signature perfectly matches her official driver's license, her corporate filings, and her banking records, Your Honor. The document is officially stamped by a licensed notary public. It is a watertight legal authorization. We are simply asking the court to enforce the transfer of Penthouse 2300 as agreed, so this family can satisfy their aggressive creditors and move on with their lives. They had played their grandest card, placing all their hopes, their entire future, and their freedom on a single forged signature, sitting in arrogant silence, completely blind to the trap they had just locked themselves inside. Judge Eleanor Hastings lowered the plastic sleeve containing the forged power of attorney and peered over the rim of her reading glasses. The heavy silence in courtroom 4B felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Leonard practically vibrated on his feet, his chest puffed out in anticipation of a swift and decisive victory. He glanced back at Thomas, who offered a slow, smug nod. They were entirely convinced they had cornered me into a legally binding surrender. The judge shifted her gaze from the plaintiff's table directly to my defense counsel. She expected a frantic flurry of objections, a desperate motion to strike the document, or a panicked plea for a recess to examine the signature's authenticity. Arthur Sterling stood up with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator that had just cornered its prey. He buttoned the center button of his charcoal jacket and offered the judge a polite, unbothered smile. "Your Honor?" Arthur began, his voice smooth and resonant, echoing perfectly in the quiet courtroom. "The defense has absolutely no objection to Plaintiff's Exhibit A being admitted into the official court record." A collective shock rippled through the opposing side. Leonard's triumphant grin vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion. He blinked rapidly, clearly thrown off his rehearsed script. He had prepared for a grueling high-stakes battle over handwriting analysis and forensic experts. He had not prepared for absolute frictionless surrender. Thomas leaned forward in his heavy wooden chair, his brow furrowing as he tried to decipher the sudden lack of resistance. Sydney stopped rubbing her pregnant belly, her manufactured tears drying up instantly as suspicion crept onto her face. Judge Hastings looked equally surprised. She raised an eyebrow, setting the document down on her elevated desk. "No objection, Mr. Sterling. You are conceding the validity of the signature, granting the transfer of a $3 million asset." "We are not conceding the validity, Your Honor." Arthur clarified, his tone remaining perfectly conversational. "But we do not object to the document being entered into evidence as the foundation of the plaintiff's claim. However, considering the extraordinary financial magnitude of this asset transfer and the severity of the liability it attempts to shift onto my client, we do have one standard procedural request before the court grants any injunctions." Judge Hastings gestured for him to proceed. "We simply request that the individuals who are presenting this document as fact specifically the plaintiff Thomas and his associate Terrence, be sworn in to testify on the official record. Arthur gestured toward the gallery where Terrence was sitting. Terrence was sporting a heavily bruised nose and a split lip from his brutal encounter with my private security team 2 nights prior, but he still wore a look of desperate, greedy defiance. Arthur turned his attention back to the bench. We ask that they confirm under oath, subject to the penalty of perjury, that they were physically present and personally witnessed. My client execute this specific document on the date and at the location printed on the page. Leonard quickly leaned over to whisper to Thomas. From my seat at the defense table, I could see the greedy calculations ticking behind my father's eyes. Thomas viewed Arthur's request not as a trap, but as a pathetic, desperate stalling tactic. He believed my high-powered attorney was grasping at straws, trying to find a minor procedural technicality because we knew we could not beat the flawless forgery. Thomas gave Leonard a curt, confident nod. "We have absolutely no problem with that." "Your Honor," Leonard announced, quickly recovering his smarmy swagger. "My clients are more than willing to swear to the truth of their claims. They have nothing to hide." Judge Hastings instructed the bailiff to call Thomas to the witness stand first. Thomas stood up, adjusting his tie and buttoning his jacket, projecting the image of an honest, aggrieved patriarch. He stepped into the witness box and placed his right hand firmly on the worn leather Bible. The bailiff asked if he swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thomas looked directly at the judge and loudly proclaimed that he did. Arthur Sterling approached the podium, resting his hands casually on the wood. He did not look like a man defending a besieged client. He looked like a man executing a flawless mathematical equation. Thomas Arthur began projecting his voice so the court reporter could capture every syllable perfectly. "You have presented a document dated October 14th, granting you full legal authority to leverage Penthouse 2300 as collateral for your commercial debts. Is that correct?" "Yes, it is," Thomas answered, his chin raised defiantly. "And you are swearing under oath, subject to the severe criminal penalties of perjury, that you physically sat in the same room with your daughter Madeline on October 14th. You witnessed her hold a pen and sign this specific piece of paper in Miami, Florida." Thomas did not even hesitate. The allure of a $3 million payday completely blinded his self-preservation instincts. "Yes, I did." Thomas lied with absolute chilling conviction. She was sitting right across from me. We had a long discussion about the family's financial situation. She felt terrible about the stress I was under, and she signed the paperwork willingly to help us out. Arthur did not challenge the lie. He simply nodded, making sure the court reporter logged the expanded fiction. "Thank you. No further questions for this witness." Thomas stepped down from the stand with a triumphant smirk, looking at me as if he had just driven the final nail into my coffin. He took his seat next to Sydney, who was now smiling openly. The bailiff then called Terrence to the stand. Terrence practically sprinted to the witness box. The private lending syndicate's deadline was breathing down his neck, and he saw this sworn testimony as the final hurdle standing between him and his survival. He placed his hand on the Bible and eagerly swore the oath, his eyes darting hungrily toward the judge's bench where the forged document rested. Arthur approached the podium again, his demeanor identical to the previous questioning. "Terrence, you are listed as the secondary witness and the representative of the beneficiary, LLC, on this document. You are swearing today, under penalty of perjury, that you were also physically present in Miami on October 14th. "Absolutely," Terrence answered eagerly, leaning into the microphone. "And you also witnessed Madeline sign this document." Arthur pressed his voice, lowering just a fraction, pulling the trap completely taut. Terrence, arrogant and eager to solidify the con, decided to add his own unnecessary flourishes to the fabricated story. "I saw her sign it with my own 2 eyes," Terrence stated loudly, his bruised face stretching into a cocky grin. "In fact, she could not find a pen in her purse, so I handed her my own pen. I watched her sign the bottom line, and then I signed my name right next to hers as the official witness." Arthur held his gaze for 3 agonizingly long seconds. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Terrence had just sworn on the Bible on the official judicial record that he had physically handed me a pen in Miami on October 14th. He had locked himself into a highly specific, easily verifiable lie. Thank you, Arthur said, a dangerous, razor-sharp edge finally entering his tone. The defense has everything it needs on the record, Your Honor. Arthur turned gracefully toward the heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom. The defense calls Dr. Elias Thorne to the stand. Leonard let out a loud, obnoxious scoff, rolling his eyes as if this were an unbearable waste of his highly valuable time. Thomas leaned back, crossing his arms and shaking his head, while Terence maintained his cocky, bruised grin. They remained entirely oblivious to the lethal snare that had just snapped shut around their ankles. The heavy doors opened, and Dr. Thorne walked down the center aisle. He was a sharply dressed, clinical-looking man carrying a locked titanium briefcase. As he took the stand and swore his oath, Arthur quickly established his credentials for the official record. Dr. Thorne was not just a handwriting analyst. He was a federal forensic document examiner, a leading specialist contracted by the Department of Justice to investigate high-level corporate espionage and sophisticated forgery rings. Arthur approached the podium, his demeanor razor-sharp. Dr. Thorne, my team provided you with a high-resolution scan of Plaintiff Exhibit A 48 hours ago, and you have just had the opportunity to physically examine the original document at the clerk desk. Please share your findings regarding the physical composition of the signature. Dr. Thorne adjusted the microphone, his voice deadpan and precise. The signature itself is a highly sophisticated optical replication, likely produced by commercial-grade rendering equipment. However, the fatal flaw is not in the shape of the letters. The fatal flaw is in the chemical composition of the ink itself. Dr. Thorne unlocked his titanium briefcase and retrieved a thick-bound forensic report, handing copies to the bailiff to distribute to the judge and opposing counsel. Leonard snatched his copy, skimming the first page before his face suddenly dropped. Terence leaned over to look, his cocky grin faltering into a mask of pure confusion. The ink used to forge this signature is not standard ballpoint or commercial gel, Dr. Thorne explained, looking directly at the judge. It is a highly specialized, proprietary micro-encapsulated ink. It contains a unique chemical tracer, originally developed for secure biometric document verification. Furthermore, federal patent records indicate that this specific chemical compound was engineered and exclusively utilized by a single company. Arthur did not miss a beat. And what company holds the exclusive rights to that specific biometric ink, Dr. Thorne? Dr. Thorne turned his gaze directly toward the plaintiff table, a now-defunct tech startup known as Apex Solutions. The color drained from Terence's face so fast he looked as though he might physically collapse. Apex Solutions was his former company, the spectacular failure that had initiated his downward spiral into debt. He had utilized his own leftover proprietary equipment to forge the document, completely unaware that the specialized ink carried a traceable, unique chemical signature. By proudly swearing under oath that he had physically handed me his own personal pen, Terence had just handed the federal government the murder weapon with his fingerprints all over the handle. Leonard jumped out of his chair, his shiny suit suddenly looking cheap and restrictive. Your Honor, I object. This is highly speculative. A pen could have been borrowed, misplaced, or picked up by my client entirely by accident. Judge Hastings slammed her gavel down with a sharp, resounding crack that silenced Leonard instantly. Overruled, she snapped, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the forensic report. You may proceed, Mr. Sterling. Arthur barely acknowledged the interruption. He simply picked up a thick manila folder from our defense table and carried it up to the bench. Dr. Thorne has expertly dismantled the how of this forgery. Now, Your Honor, we will dismantle the where and the when. My clients at the plaintiff table have just sworn under penalty of perjury that they sat in a room with my client in Miami, Florida, on the afternoon of October 14th and watched her physically sign this document. Arthur handed the folder to the judge. I am submitting Defense Exhibit B into the official record. These are certified time-stamped documents procured directly from United States Customs and Border Protection, accompanied by official flight manifests from British Airways and time-stamped security footage from the Savoy Hotel. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. Sydney stopped her theatrical whimpering, her eyes darting between her father and the judge. On the morning of October 12th, my client boarded a transatlantic flight out of Miami International Airport. Arthur stated, his voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. She landed at Heathrow Airport in London, where her passport was officially scanned and logged by UK Border Force. She remained in the United Kingdom for a highly publicized documented international real estate summit. She did not return to American soil until October 18th. It was physically, geographically, and temporally impossible for Madeline to be sitting in a room in Miami on October 14th. The silence that fell over courtroom 4B was absolute and suffocating. It was not the silence of anticipation, but the terrifying quiet of impending doom. The plaintiffs had not just lied in a civil dispute. They had walked into a court of law, placed their hands on a Bible, and sworn a highly detailed, easily disproven lie directly to a judge. Judge Hastings slowly lowered the customs report. She did not look angry. She looked utterly, terrifyingly furious. The air in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. She removed her reading glasses and directed a lethal, piercing glare at the plaintiff table. Leonard was frantically shoving papers back into his battered briefcase, physically leaning away from Thomas and Terence, as if their sudden criminality was contagious. He was already calculating how fast he could file a motion to withdraw as their counsel. Thomas sat frozen, his jaw working silently, completely incapable of processing the magnitude of his defeat. Terence was trembling, his eyes wide with stark, unadulterated terror. "Mr. Sterling!" Judge Hastings said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "The defense evidence is accepted into the record." She turned her icy stare to the plaintiff table. "In my 20 years on this bench, I have rarely witnessed such a brazen, arrogant, and spectacularly stupid display of perjury. You came into my courtroom, you swore an oath before this court, and you presented a forged document in a malicious attempt to extort $3 million. Thomas opened his mouth, stammering, "Your Honor, please, there must be some kind of misunderstanding. I can explain." "You will have plenty of time to explain yourself to the federal prosecutor," Judge Hastings interrupted, cutting him off with brutal efficiency. She looked over the bench toward the armed officers stationed by the doors. "Bailiffs, take them into custody, now." The heavy courtroom doors did not just open, they were practically thrown wide. 4 uniformed bailiffs and 2 men wearing plainclothes federal badges marched down the center aisle. The swiftness of the execution meant Marcus Vance had alerted the authorities well in advance, coordinating the trap to spring the moment the perjury was officially on the record. "Get your hands off me!" Thomas roared, his manufactured dignity evaporating as a bailiff forcefully grabbed his arms and wrenched them behind his back. "I am a respected businessman. You cannot do this." The heavy steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a sharp metallic finality. Terence did not fight. As a federal agent yanked him out of his chair and secured his wrists, his knees practically gave out. He sobbed openly, a pathetic broken sound, realizing that his attempt to escape a private lending syndicate had just earned him a guaranteed stay in a federal penitentiary. They were being arrested right in the middle of the courtroom for rampant perjury and severe federal wire fraud. Sydney watched the men in her life being treated like common criminals and entirely lost her grip on reality. The calculated, manipulative victimhood vanished, replaced by genuine hysterical panic. She leaped out of her chair, no longer leaning heavily or clutching her stomach, and began screaming at the top of her lungs. "No, you cannot take them. What about me? What about my baby? Who is going to pay for our house?" She clawed at the air, her face streaked with ruined makeup, sobbing hysterically as the bailiffs dragged her husband and her father down the aisle and out of the courtroom. Her shrieks echoed off the polished wood paneling, a frantic symphony of absolute ruin. I remained seated at the defense table, my posture flawless, watching the chaotic scene unfold with cold, detached satisfaction. The snare had not just closed, it had obliterated them. The echoes of Sydney's hysterical sobs faded from the courtroom, replaced by the swift, clinical machinery of federal justice. Within 72 hours, the sheer magnitude of their legal nightmare fully materialized. Thomas and Terence managed to secure temporary release on bail, but it was a hollow, heavily shackled freedom. Federal magistrates do not take kindly to brazen perjury and wire fraud executed within a judge's chambers. Their passports were immediately seized and locked in an evidence vault, neutralizing any flight risk. Heavy tamper-proof GPS ankle monitors were strapped to their legs, tethering them to the immediate county limits. More devastatingly, the Department of Justice froze every single one of their bank accounts, both domestic and offshore. They walked out of the federal holding center not as arrogant conquerors, but as penniless, monitored inmates awaiting their inevitable sentencing. The freezing of their liquid assets was merely the first domino to fall in a spectacular chain reaction of total ruin. The moment the federal indictments hit the public record, the private lending syndicate that Terrence owed $3 million to realized their illicit money was permanently gone. They immediately initiated aggressive, highly intimidating collection protocols, but the federal government had already beaten them to the punch. The intricate, fraudulent shadow mortgage Terrence had attempted to secure was thoroughly audited by financial regulators. That audit exposed the toxic, rotting core of Thomas's desperation. To back Terrence's initial failing loans, Thomas had secretly and illegally collateralized his own primary residence. He had bet his entire life's foundation on a desperate gamble, and the house always wins. The commercial bank holding the original mortgage on my parents' lavish Miami estate moved with predatory speed. Financial institutions of that caliber possess absolutely zero tolerance for fraudulent cross-collateralization and federal indictments. Because their accounts were completely locked down by the DOJ and the secondary loans were in catastrophic default, the bank initiated an immediate, expedited foreclosure process. There was no grace period, no lengthy negotiation, no restructuring plan, and absolutely no pity. The sprawling six-bedroom Mediterranean mansion that Brenda had spent decades meticulously decorating and parading before her high society friends was abruptly seized. A stark neon orange foreclosure notice was nailed directly to their custom mahogany front door, serving as a glaring public broadcast of their absolute, undeniable ruin. For individuals like Thomas and Brenda, whose entire existence was predicated on projecting an illusion of flawless, untouchable wealth, the social fallout was far more agonizing than the legal peril. The news of the courtroom arrest and the biometric ink forgery spread through Miami's elite gossiping circles like wildfire. The exact same country club executives who had happily accepted Brenda's exorbitant membership dues swiftly and silently revoked her privileges, citing a strict morality clause in the bylaws. She discovered her total excommunication when her access card flashed red at the private gates and she was turned away by security. Former business associates refused Thomas's desperate phone calls. Friends who had eagerly attended their lavish catered dinner parties suddenly treated them as toxic pariahs. They were entirely cut off from the very society they had sacrificed their morality to impress. Sydney's manufactured reality fractured alongside her parents'. With Terrence facing decades in federal prison and their joint accounts locked down, her luxurious, carefree lifestyle evaporated overnight. She packed whatever designer bags she could carry and fled their upscale leased condo before the landlord could serve the eviction papers, running back to her childhood home for shelter. But the sanctuary she expected to run to no longer existed. She arrived at the estate only to find her mother in the midst of a total psychological breakdown, surrounded by half-packed cardboard boxes and cold, indifferent bank representatives inventorying their antique furniture. The golden child had returned to a kingdom of ash, entirely unequipped to handle the harsh elements of the real world. I received the final detailed update from Marcus Vance as I sat in my quiet penthouse, reviewing my quarterly philanthropic budgets. His private security contacts had monitored the eviction from a discreet distance, ensuring no final desperate attempts were made to contact me. He described a scene devoid of any lingering arrogance. There were no more threats of lawsuits or demands for my compliance. There was only the grim, harsh reality of impending homelessness. Thomas stripped of his custom-tailored suits and his patriarchal authority stood on the sidewalk wearing a faded polo shirt, watching a discount moving crew load a fraction of their belongings into a rented storage truck. Brenda was hyperventilating on the manicured front lawn, clutching a single crystal vase, weeping uncontrollably as the bank locks were changed. Sydney stood frozen by the curb, her hands resting on her pregnant belly, staring blankly at the orange notice on the door, finally comprehending that her child would be born into absolute, undeniable poverty. They had spent their entire lives attempting to diminish me, treating me as an expendable asset to be utilized and discarded at their convenience. They had orchestrated public humiliation, emotional manipulation, and federal crimes simply to maintain their comfortable parasitic existence. Yet in their frantic, unhinged frenzy to steal my empire, they had systematically and permanently dismantled their own. The wealth they worshipped, the pride they wielded as a weapon, and the social standing they guarded so fiercely were completely obliterated. They were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, the heavy federal monitors on their ankles, and the inescapable knowledge that they had engineered their own flawless destruction. The weekend evaporated, leaving the ashes of their former lives to settle over Miami. By Monday morning, I was back in the sanctuary of my corporate headquarters, a gleaming fortress of glass and steel towering above the financial district. The 50th floor belonged entirely to my investment firm, an ecosystem of hushed efficiency, polished marble, and panoramic views of Biscayne Bay. I was seated behind my massive obsidian desk, deep in the review of a highly sensitive acquisition, perfectly insulated from the chaos I had unleashed upon Thomas and his conspirators. Or so I thought. My strict security protocols were designed to filter out corporate spies and aggressive media, not the frantic, unhinged desperation of ruined relatives. Brenda and Sydney managed to bypass the ground floor security by latching onto a group of visiting international delegates, slipping into the private elevator bank before the lobby guards could intercept them. When the heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite opened, my receptionist, a highly trained former corporate contractor, stood up to intercept them, but she was too late. They pushed past her with the feral momentum of cornered animals. I did not flinch as my office door burst open. I simply set my pen down and leaned back in my leather chair. The visual contrast was jarring. Gone were the immaculate salon blowouts, the thousands of dollars in jewelry, and the suffocating aura of unearned superiority. Brenda looked as though she had aged a decade over the weekend. Her hair was a tangled mess, her designer blouse was violently wrinkled, and her face was pale and drawn. Sydney looked even worse. The confident golden child who had smirked at my supposed downfall just days ago was trembling uncontrollably, her eyes bloodshot and swollen from days of continuous crying. They did not march in demanding my compliance. They did not threaten me with Thomas's fabricated authority or Terrence's imaginary leverage. Instead, they executed a maneuver so entirely devoid of dignity that it left my executive assistant standing just outside the door, staring in open-mouthed shock. They dropped to their knees. Right there in the center of my office, upon the hand-woven Persian rug, my mother and my sister collapsed. Because my office was entirely enclosed in floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass, the entire senior executive floor had a front-row seat to their spectacular humiliation. Analysts, portfolio managers, and legal advisors stopped what they were doing, watching the bizarre pantomime unfolding inside the CEO's office. Sydney launched the opening salvo, instantly weaponizing her pregnancy. She thrust her hands beneath her swollen belly, leaning forward as if the physical weight of her unborn child was pulling her to the ground. She began to sob loud, gasping theatrical wails that vibrated through the soundproof glass. "Madeline, please!" Sydney choked out her voice, a ragged, desperate plea. "You have to help us. You have to save us. Terrence is facing federal prison. They took his passport. They took his accounts. I have absolutely nothing left. The bank locked us out of the house." She crawled a few inches forward, her tears splashing onto the pristine rug. "How can you do this to your own flesh and blood? How can you let your niece or nephew be born into the street? We have nowhere to go. We are going to be homeless. Just write the check. Please, Madeline. It is pocket change to you. You can pay off the bank today. You can stop the foreclosure right now. You can save my baby." She was utilizing the ultimate emotional extortion, attempting to place the burden of her child's future squarely on my shoulders. It was a masterful display of toxic manipulation, entirely ignoring the fact that her husband and her father had literally forged my signature in a federal crime to steal my assets just to cover their own illegal gambling debts. Before I could even register the absolute audacity of Sydney's request, Brenda threw herself into the fray. The woman who had spent my entire adolescence telling me I was a relentless disappointment, who had stood by while Thomas belittled my achievements and funneled my college funds to Sydney, was now kneeling on my floor, reaching out with trembling, desperate hands. She did not dare touch the hem of my tailored skirt, hovering her hands just inches away in a pathetic display of submission. "We were wrong," Brenda wailed, her voice cracking as she looked up at me with wild, terrified eyes. "Thomas was foolish. Terrence lied to us all. We did not know how bad it was. We are so sorry, Madeline. I am so sorry. You are my daughter, my brilliant, successful daughter. I should have protected you." The hypocrisy was so dense it was almost suffocating. She was attempting to rewrite 30 years of emotional neglect and psychological abuse in 30 seconds, hoping that a few cheap tears would erase the reality of their calculated betrayal. "If you just pay the bank," Brenda pleaded, her words spilling out in a frantic, unbroken stream. "If you just wire the funds to clear the mortgage and get Thomas out of this legal mess, I swear everything will be different. We will be a real family. We can start over. Thomas will respect you. Sydney will respect you. We will invite you to Sunday dinners. You can be the godmother to the baby. We will be the family you always wanted. Just please, Madeline, do not let them take my home. Do not leave me with nothing. Just write the check and we can be a real family again." I sat in total silence, watching the two women grovel at my feet. They were offering me the illusion of a family, a toxic conditional affection that they were willing to sell to me for the exact price of a foreclosed Miami mansion. They did not want reconciliation. They did not want forgiveness. They wanted an ATM. They were kneeling before the very person they had actively conspired to ruin, begging for salvation, purely because I was the last remaining bank account they had not managed to drain. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement required to ask the victim of their federal extortion plot to bail them out of the consequences was staggering. I looked down at them, feeling absolutely no pity, no lingering familial guilt, and no desire to purchase their hollow affection. I allowed their frantic, wet sobbing to echo against the acoustic glass of my office for a long, unbroken minute. I did not offer a tissue. I did not offer a comforting word. Instead, I reached for the delicate porcelain teapot resting on the silver tray at the corner of my obsidian desk. With slow, meticulous precision, I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey. The fragrant steam curled into the chilled, climate-controlled air of the executive suite, a stark contrast to the sweaty, desperate panic radiating from the two women kneeling on my Persian rug. I took a slow sip, savoring the quiet power of the moment, letting them exhaust their vocal cords until their wails dissolved into pathetic, hiccuping gasps. "You are offering to be my family as if it is a premium subscription service I can purchase with a wire transfer," I finally said, placing the delicate teacup back onto its saucer with a sharp, definitive click. "You genuinely believe that your affection has a monetary value and that you can leverage it to escape the consequences of federal fraud. It is a fascinating psychological study, Brenda. Even now, kneeling in the wreckage of your own malicious greed, your first instinct is to try and sell me an illusion." Brenda blinked rapidly, her tear-streaked face contorting in confusion. She reached out, her voice trembling. "Madeline, please, we are giving you what you always wanted. We can be whole again. Just pay the bank. You have the liquidity. You can stop the foreclosure right now and make all of this go away." I smiled. It was not a smile of warmth or reconciliation. It was a cold, clinical baring of teeth. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and retrieved a heavy, thick legal folder bound with red archival tape. I dropped it onto the center of the desk and pushed it smoothly across the polished black surface. It stopped right at the edge, hovering just above their eye level. I did not just pay off the bank, I stated, my voice dropping to a low lethal register that demanded absolute silence. You fundamentally misunderstand the mechanics of the financial trap you walked into. 2 weeks ago, when I discovered Terrence was attempting to weaponize my corporate identity to secure a shadow mortgage, I did not just prepare a defense, I went on the offensive. Sydney stopped crying, her hands slowly sliding away from her pregnant belly as a new, unfamiliar terror began to dawn in her eyes. "What does that mean?" she whispered, staring at the thick folder as if it were a live explosive. "It means I deployed my anonymous subsidiary investment firm to trace the exact origin of Terrence's catastrophic $3 million loan," I explained, watching the blood drain completely from their faces. Private lending syndicates, especially the highly dangerous offshore entities Terrence decided to do business with, are always willing to offload high-risk toxic debt for immediate clean liquidity. I approached them through a blind proxy. I purchased the entirety of Terrence's toxic debt for pennies on the dollar. I bought the paper. I bought the leverage. Brenda let out a small strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together, resting them on the desk. "I am not stepping in to save you from the syndicate, Brenda. I am the syndicate. I am now your sole creditor. I hold the paper on the $3 million loan, and because Thomas foolishly and illegally cross-collateralized his primary residence to back that loan, I hold the absolute rights to your home. The bank is not foreclosing on you. I am personally foreclosing on you." The silence that followed was absolute. The sheer terrifying magnitude of their defeat finally crushed the last remaining embers of their arrogance. They had crawled into my office begging for a savior, only to discover they were kneeling before their executioner. The realization that I owned their debt, their home, and their immediate survival hit them with the force of a freight train. "You cannot do this!" Sydney choked out, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes wide with a horrified, vacant stare. "You are our blood. You cannot put us on the street. You put yourselves on the street the moment you decided to forge my signature and commit federal wire fraud." I corrected her with surgical precision. "As your sole creditor, I have absolutely no intention of extending the loan, offering a grace period, or restructuring your toxic debt. I am accelerating the debt effective immediately. The $3 million is due in full, and since you do not possess the liquidity to satisfy the margins, the seizure of your property is final. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises before my private security contractors physically remove you." Brenda slumped forward, her forehead resting against the edge of my desk, letting out a low, guttural moan of absolute defeat. She had nothing left to bargain with. The social standing she worshipped was gone. The wealth she hoarded was evaporated. "But there is one final piece of business we must conclude," I said, tapping the heavy folder. "The sale of the house will not cover the entirety of the debt, plus the accrued penalties and the legal fees I incurred dismantling your pathetic extortion plot. You are still in the red. However, I am willing to offer you a singular non-negotiable settlement to close the margins." Sydney looked up, a pathetic spark of desperate hope returning to her tear-drenched eyes. "Anything. What do we have to do?" I unclipped a heavy silver fountain pen from my blazer and laid it perfectly parallel to the legal folder. "I require the immediate, uncontested transfer of all your remaining liquid and physical assets. I want the titles to the luxury vehicles currently sitting in your driveway. I want the deeds to the 2 remaining investment properties Thomas controls. And Brenda, I want you to sign over your entire collection of insured jewelry, the diamonds, the Rolexes, every piece of high society armor you possess. You will sign the asset transfer forms right now in this office." Brenda recoiled as if I had struck her, clutching her throat. "You want to strip us bare. You want to take everything. I want what is legally owed to me," I replied, my voice hard and unyielding. "And if you refuse to sign over those assets right this second, I will pick up my phone and contact the federal prosecutors handling Thomas and Terrence's criminal case. I will personally push the FBI and the Department of Justice to seek the absolute maximum federal prison sentences for both of them. I will bury them so deep in the federal penal system that your child will be in high school before Terrence sees daylight again." I gestured to the silver pen resting on the desk. Sign over the assets, Brenda, or I make sure your husband and your golden son-in-law die in prison. The choice is entirely yours." The heavy silver fountain pen felt cold against Brenda's trembling fingers. The reality of the ultimatum left no room for negotiation or pride. With slow, agonizing strokes, she signed away the last remnants of her artificial royalty. Sydney followed suit, sobbing quietly as she relinquished the titles to the luxury vehicles she had flaunted across Miami. When they finally stood and walked out of the glass-walled office, they were entirely hollowed out. They descended the corporate elevator, stripped of their armor, their assets, and their remaining dignity, leaving only the crushing weight of their self-inflicted ruin. By late November, the harsh consequences of those signatures had fully materialized. The relentless Florida heat had given way to a biting, unseasonable chill, perfectly mirroring the stark desolation of their new existence. With the sprawling Mediterranean estate officially locked down and transferred into the possession of my anonymous investment firm, the family had been violently ejected from the stratosphere of Miami elite. They were entirely out of options, out of favors, and out of hidden funds. Their new residence was a claustrophobic fluorescent purgatory known as the Suncoast Motor Inn, a cheap, dingy motel situated just off a roaring stretch of the interstate. The sensory degradation of their new environment was absolute. The steady hum of passing 18-wheelers rattled the thin single-pane windows day and night. The carpet was a stiff, stained industrial brown that perpetually smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. Instead of sprawling across 6 master suites, 4 adults accustomed to the height of luxury were now violently crammed into a single standard room. 2 sagging queen-sized beds dominated the cramped space, leaving barely enough room to navigate to the single poorly ventilated bathroom. For Thomas and Terrence, the motel room was an inescapable physical prison. Out on federal bail but still awaiting their sentencing, they were strictly bound by the heavy black GPS ankle monitors strapped to their legs. The flashing red lights of the devices cast an eerie glow in the dark room, serving as a constant, humiliating reminder of their impending federal incarceration. Thomas spent his days sitting on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring blankly at the static on the analog television, his manufactured patriarchal authority completely broken. Terrence paced the narrow strip of stained carpet between the beds like a caged animal, his former cocky grin replaced by a gaunt, haunted expression of pure terror. Sydney was perhaps suffering the most visceral shock. Heavily pregnant and deprived of the pampered, stress-free environment she believed was her birthright, she complained endlessly. The cheap mattress hurt her back, the tap water tasted metallic, and the constant roar of the highway kept her awake. She spent hours crying in the cramped bathroom, mourning the loss of the designer nursery she had planned and the high society baby showers she would never have. The realization that her child would be born into this squalor while her husband faced a maximum security prison sentence had finally fractured her carefully constructed delusion of superiority. Then Thanksgiving arrived, delivering a crushing psychological blow that magnified their destitution. In years past, Thanksgiving was not a holiday of gratitude for Brenda and Thomas. It was a competitive pageant. It was an opportunity to hold court at the exclusive Pelican Club, surrounded by crystal flutes of vintage champagne towers of chilled oysters and fawning waitstaff catering to their every whim. They would dress in their finest custom-tailored autumn apparel and project an image of flawless, untouchable prosperity to their wealthy peers. This year there was no country club, there was no champagne. Brenda stood over a stained, rattling microwave, balancing a stack of flimsy paper plates. The holiday feast consisted of processed turkey slices swimming in artificial gravy, microwaved scoops of instant mashed potatoes, and gelatinous slabs of canned cranberry sauce. The paper plates actually bent beneath the weight of the depressing, lukewarm food. They sat on the edges of the beds, eating in suffocating silence, the plastic utensils snapping against the cheap paper. The stark contrast between their former opulence and their current reality was a bitter, unswallowable pill. Yet even in the depths of this absolute ruin, Brenda refused to surrender her manipulative instincts. The sheer magnitude of their defeat had not erased her fundamental belief that she could somehow scheme her way out of the consequences. She looked around the dismal motel room at her broken husband, her terrified son-in-law, and her sobbing pregnant daughter, and formulated one last desperate, incredibly pathetic strategy. She decided to weaponize the holiday. Brenda walked down to the motel lobby and purchased a cheap generic Thanksgiving card from a dusty wire rack. Returning to the room, she cleared a space on the wobbly laminate desk and sat down with a borrowed ballpoint pen. She began to write, crafting a message completely saturated in manufactured guilt and toxic sentimentality. She did not apologize for the perjury, the forgery, or the extortion attempt. Instead, she relied on the heavy emotional weight of the holiday to do the heavy lifting. She wrote about family blood and the sacred bonds of Thanksgiving. She painted a tragic picture of their current living conditions, deliberately emphasizing Sydney's pregnancy and the dismal, cramped motel room. She pleaded for a truce, begging me to come to the motel and share their humble canned meal so we could heal the divide. But beneath the tear-stained ink and the pathetic appeals to family unity, the true motive was glaringly obvious. The invitation was a desperate, calculated bid to guilt me into showing mercy. She was praying that the visual shock of seeing her family eating processed food on paper plates would override my logic. She hoped the holiday spirit would somehow compel me to release the financial chokehold on their assets, and more importantly, to contact the federal prosecutors and call off the hounds currently preparing to send Thomas and Terrence to prison. Brenda sealed the cheap envelope and walked it down to the motel reception, paying the clerk with her last few crumpled dollars to have it sent via expedited courier to my corporate headquarters. She returned to the room and sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for the emotional manipulation to take effect, entirely failing to grasp that the snare she was trying to escape had already been permanently sealed. Brenda waited on the edge of the sagging mattress, her eyes glued to the cheap veneer door of the motel room. When the sharp, authoritative knock finally came, she scrambled to her feet, frantically smoothing her wrinkled clothes. A desperate, manufactured smile was plastered across her pale face. She yanked the door open, fully prepared to launch into her carefully rehearsed speech of familial reconciliation and holiday forgiveness. I stood on the cracked concrete walkway, completely undisturbed by the biting November wind that swept off the nearby interstate. I wore a pristine ankle-length cashmere coat in a deep, rich camel hue, paired with flawless leather gloves and immaculate stiletto boots. The sheer cost of my attire alone could have paid for their miserable motel room for an entire decade. The visual contrast was absolute, deliberate, and devastating. I stepped past Brenda without waiting for an invitation, bringing the crisp, elegant scent of expensive perfume into the suffocating cloud of cheap bleach, stale cigarette smoke, and despair. The room was even more dismal than Marcus had detailed in his daily security briefings. Thomas sat frozen in a battered armchair, his jaw going slack as I took in the pathetic Thanksgiving feast spread across the wobbly laminate desk. Canned cranberry sauce quivered precariously on flimsy paper plates next to lukewarm processed meat and instant potatoes. Sydney clutched her pregnant belly, shrinking back against the peeling wallpaper. My eyes quickly darted to the second bed where Terrence froze midway through, zipping a large, overstuffed canvas duffel bag. He had been quietly, desperately packing. I did not take off my coat. I did not accept the wobbly plastic chair Brenda frantically tried to offer me. I simply stood in the center of the cramped room and looked at the miserable spread, then at the 4 people who had spent my entire life trying to break me. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating. The sheer pressure of my unyielding clinical stare cracked their fragile, desperate facade wide open. The manufactured unity Brenda had tried to sell in her cheap greeting card evaporated in an instant. The implosion was spectacular, violent, and entirely self-directed. Terrence was the first to snap. His eyes darted from my calm demeanor to Thomas, and a frantic, cornered rage took over. The paralyzing fear of federal prison stripped away his remaining filter. He pointed a shaking finger at his father-in-law, his voice escalating into a hysterical shout. "This is your fault, Thomas." Terrence spat, the veins in his neck bulging. "You told me the cross-collateralization would hold. You told me your elite bank contacts were completely blind to the shadow loans. I trusted you to secure the backdoor funds, and you led us straight into a federal trap. You lost the house because you were sloppy. Thomas shot out of his chair, his face turning a mottled, furious red, as his bruised pride flared into defensive rage. You arrogant parasite! Thomas roared back, closing the distance between them and jabbing his finger at Terrence's chest. You brought that criminal syndicate to our doorstep. You dragged my pristine reputation into your degenerate, unpayable gambling debts. You forged her signature right in front of a federal judge. You destroyed my entire legacy. Brenda, witnessing her husband being verbally assaulted by the man who had finalized their total financial ruin, completely lost her grip on reality. She rounded on Sydney, her hands flying in wild, erratic gestures, her voice echoing painfully in the cramped, poorly insulated room. You brought this criminal into our home, Brenda shrieked, advancing on her pregnant daughter without a shred of maternal instinct. You married a complete fraud, Sydney. You paraded him around the country club like he was a king, demanding we fund your lavish lifestyle, and he stripped us of absolutely everything. You and your worthless husband have destroyed this family. We are living in a roadside motel because of your spectacular stupidity. Sydney burst into fresh, hysterical tears, shrinking away from her mother but screaming right back. She blamed Brenda for constantly enabling Thomas, and she blamed Thomas for funding Terrence's non-existent ventures just to keep up appearances. They tore into each other like starved animals fighting over a meaningless scrap of meat. In their desperate rush to deflect the blame for their catastrophic downfall, they completely forgot my presence. I watched the chaotic, vicious scene unfold with absolute chilling detachment. I did not raise my voice to interrupt their screaming match. I did not offer solutions or comfort. I simply waited until they exhausted themselves, their shouts slowly devolving into heavy, ragged panting. They turned back to me, their chests heaving, their eyes wide, waiting for the salvation they still somehow believed I owed them. You sent me an invitation asking for a truce, I said, my voice slicing through the stale, heated air with the precision of a scalpel. You wrote about blood and the sacred bonds of Thanksgiving. You begged me to remember that we are a family. But looking at you now, tearing each other apart the very second the pressure becomes unbearable, it is clearer than ever. I stepped closer, my gaze locking onto Brenda, then Thomas, and finally Sydney. You never loved me, not for a single second of my entire life. You only loved what you could extract from me. I was never a daughter or a sister to any of you. I was a convenient resource, an asset to be managed, a bank account to be drained, and a target to be humiliated to feed your own fragile, insatiable egos. You do not want a family reunion today. You want a bailout. I looked at the wobbly desk, at the bending paper plates and the sad processed food. I have absolutely no appetite for your apologies, and I certainly have no appetite for this. I turned my back on them, ignoring Brenda's sudden renewed wailing as she realized her final manipulation had failed completely. I walked out the door, letting it click shut firmly behind me. The biting autumn air felt remarkably refreshing as I descended the concrete exterior stairs to the parking lot. As my hand reached the door handle of my waiting car, the quiet, desolate night was violently shattered. A swarm of unmarked black SUVs and local police cruisers tore into the motel parking lot, tires screeching against the asphalt. Their flashing red and blue lights painted the dingy building in chaotic, blinding strobes. I had noticed Terrence's overstuffed duffel bag immediately upon entering the room, but I had not waited until tonight to act. Hours earlier, I had tipped off the FBI case agent assigned to their file that Terrence was actively securing burner phones and packing to flee the country, a direct and severe violation of the strict terms of his federal bail. Heavily armed federal agents swarmed the second-floor walkway, their boots thundering against the concrete, before kicking the door of room 214 wide open. I stood calmly by my car, my posture flawless, adjusting my leather gloves. I watched as Terrence was dragged out into the freezing night in heavy steel handcuffs, his frantic escape permanently aborted. The implosion was finally complete. I watched the taillights of the federal transport van vanish down the interstate, taking Terrence into the belly of the justice system. The cold November wind whipped around me, As I slid into the heated leather seat of my car, the chaos of the motel parking lot fading into irrelevant background noise. The federal machinery had been engaged, and once that massive, unfeeling apparatus begins to move, it crushes everything in its path. The ensuing months were a masterclass in bureaucratic dismantling. I did not attend the endless array of preliminary hearings, depositions, or bail revocation meetings. I simply received the sterile, highly detailed transcripts from my legal team. Terrence's pathetic attempt to flee had permanently revoked any leniency the presiding judge might have originally entertained. His natural charisma and slick manipulation tactics, which had served him so well in the opulent boardrooms of Miami, were utterly useless against a federal prosecutor wielding an airtight paper trail. The government built a fortified case constructed entirely from the fraudulent shadow mortgage documents, the offshore wire transfers, and the panicked electronic footprint he left while trying to secure a forged passport on the black market. When sentencing day finally arrived the following spring, I did not bother to make an appearance in the courtroom gallery. I preferred to read the final judgment from the quiet, climate-controlled comfort of my office. The consequences handed down by the federal judge were absolute and permanent. Terrence was sentenced to 7 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary. The wire fraud alone would have carried a substantial penalty, but his documented status as an active flight risk guaranteed he would serve his time in a medium security facility, with zero chance of early parole. He was stripped of his tailored suits, his luxury watches, and his fabricated swagger, trading them for a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit and a concrete cell. He would not see the outside world until his newborn child was in the 2nd grade. Thomas stood beside his disgraced son-in-law before the same judge, trembling and thoroughly broken. The formidable patriarch of the Miami elite had withered into a frail, terrified old man, stripped of all his manufactured bravado. The judge took pity on his advanced age and his rapidly failing health, officially sparing him a physical prison cell. However, the alternative he received was its own kind of lifelong sentence. Thomas was slapped with 5 years of heavily monitored federal probation and ordered to pay catastrophic financial restitution to the various entities he had defrauded. The bankruptcy that followed was absolute and total. Every hidden asset, every offshore account, every last cent of his meticulously hoarded wealth was seized, frozen, and liquidated by the government. More devastating to Thomas than the financial ruin was the permanent, highly publicized destruction of his reputation. His name became a toxic punchline, a cautionary tale whispered among the wealthy investors and country club elites he had spent his entire life trying to impress. He was a pariah, permanently exiled from the only social stratosphere he had ever valued. He could not even walk into a local grocery store without being recognized as a convicted fraudster. The collateral damage extended far beyond the courtroom walls, violently reshaping the lives of the women who had enabled the extortion. Sydney, the perpetual golden child who had never worked a single hour of hard labor in her entire pampered existence, slammed face first into the crushing reality of deep poverty. Her child was born not in a private luxury suite overlooking the ocean, but in a chaotic, underfunded county hospital. Stripped of her unlimited credit cards, her luxury vehicles, and her incarcerated husband, she was forced to do the one thing she considered fundamentally beneath her. She had to get a job. Without a college degree, a resume, or any marketable skills, her options were non-existent. The Miami socialite who once spent her afternoons casually browsing designer boutiques was reduced to working grueling overnight shifts at a local 24-hour discount grocery store. I received a comprehensive report from my private investigators detailing her new routine. She spent her nights hauling heavy cardboard boxes, aggressively stocking shelves with canned goods, and scrubbing commercial spills beneath the harsh, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights. Her perfectly manicured nails were permanently chipped and broken. Her silk dresses replaced by a stiff, poorly fitted polyester uniform that smelled perpetually of industrial disinfectant and stale produce. She functioned on a maximum of 3 hours of sleep, returning to a cramped, unair-conditioned studio apartment at dawn to care for a screaming newborn entirely alone. The sheer physical exhaustion and the mental anguish of her new reality aged her a decade in a matter of months. And then there was Brenda. The grand architect of their collective downfall was now permanently imprisoned in the wreckage of her own malicious greed. With Thomas strictly confined by federal probation and Sydney barely earning enough minimum wage to cover cheap formula and diapers, Brenda was left with nothing but perpetual poverty and an agonizing, inescapable regret. She spent her days trapped in a grim, low-income apartment complex situated in a high-crime neighborhood miles away from the manicured lawns and gated driveways she had once ruled with an iron fist. The woman who used to measure her worth by the carat weight of her diamonds and the brand name on her handbag now measured it by counting pennies to pay the electric bill. She had absolutely no social standing, no friends to invite over for catered luncheons, and no wealth to wield as a weapon against those she deemed inferior. Her former high society peers had blocked her number and scrubbed her from their lives the moment the federal indictments were unsealed. Brenda was forced to sit in the stifling heat of a tiny, decrepit living room staring blankly at the peeling paint on the walls, with nothing to keep her company but the crushing knowledge that she had orchestrated this exact outcome. She had tried to destroy me out of pure, unadulterated spite, and in doing so, she had successfully annihilated her husband, her daughter, and her golden son-in-law. The consequences of her cruelty were fully realized, leaving her to rot in the very gutter she had dug for me. The consequences of her cruelty were fully realized, leaving her to rot in the very gutter she had dug for me. Yet, like a parasite desperate for a host, Brenda could not accept that the final bridge had been burned. It was a humid Tuesday afternoon in late April when she made her last pathetic attempt to breach the fortress of my new life. I was sitting in the quiet, temperature-controlled sanctuary of my penthouse office, finalizing the quarterly reports for my investment firm. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the glittering Miami skyline and the vast azure expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. My private desk phone chimed a soft, unobtrusive sound that signaled a call directly from the lobby concierge. When I answered, the concierge sounded uncharacteristically tense, apologizing for the interruption before explaining that a frantic, disheveled woman, claiming to be my mother, was causing a severe disturbance on the ground floor. With a single tap on my tablet, I pulled up the high-definition security feed from the main lobby. The visual contrast was almost jarring. The lobby of my building was a masterpiece of modern minimalism, featuring imported Italian marble floors, sleek chrome fixtures, and lush tropical foliage. Standing in the dead center of this pristine environment was Brenda. She looked entirely foreign, stripped of her designer labels and expensive salon blowouts. She wore faded, ill-fitting clothes and her face was red and blotchy. She was putting on a masterful, theatrical performance, sobbing wildly and clutching the pristine marble reception desk. She was wailing loud enough for passing residents to hear, begging the concierge to calm me down, screaming that she just needed $1,000 to cover her overdue motel rent before they threw her out onto the street. It was a classic Brenda tactic. She was trying to weaponize public embarrassment, assuming I would rush down with a checkbook just to quiet her and avoid a scandal in front of my elite neighbors. She still operated under the delusion that I cared about the optics of her manufactured tragedy. I did not go down. I did not feel a single ounce of panic, guilt, or obligation. I sat in my plush leather chair and watched her silent, frantic weeping on the high-resolution monitor with absolute surgical detachment. She was no longer a towering, terrifying figure of authority. She was just a desperate stranger throwing a tantrum in a lobby she did not belong in. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and summoned Marcus, my head of private security. While I waited for him to enter, I opened the bottom drawer of my obsidian desk and retrieved a small, locked mahogany box. Inside rested a single crumpled item. It was the exact same $100 bill that Thomas had violently thrown at my face in that upscale restaurant so many months ago, back when they believed I was nothing more than a disposable peasant begging for a crumb of their wealth. I had kept it as a morbid souvenir, a daily reminder of the exact value they had placed on my dignity. I placed the wrinkled bill inside a thick, cream-colored security envelope, Beside it, I slid in a piece of heavy embossed corporate stationery. I uncapped my silver fountain pen and wrote 5 definitive words in bold, sharp ink. Debt paid. Do not return. I sealed the envelope just as Marcus stepped into the office. I handed it to him, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I instructed him to go down to the lobby, hand this directly to the woman causing the disturbance, and then permanently escort her off the premises. I explicitly ordered him to ensure she was blacklisted from the building and to contact local law enforcement for criminal trespassing if she ever set foot on the property again. I turned my attention back to the security monitor and watched the final act of this miserable saga unfold. Marcus, a towering figure in a tailored dark suit, approached the reception desk with quiet, intimidating authority. I watched Brenda immediately amplify her sobbing, reaching out to him with shaking hands, fully expecting him to hand over the $1,000 she demanded. Marcus simply handed her the sealed envelope, delivered my message, and gestured firmly toward the heavy glass exit doors. Even without audio, I could see the exact moment Brenda tore open the envelope. I watched her frantic, greedy fingers pull out the single crumpled $100 bill. Her face froze. The theatrical sobbing stopped, instantly replaced by a mask of pure, horrified comprehension as she read the short note. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The absolute finality of the gesture completely paralyzed her. She looked up at the security camera mounted in the corner of the lobby, knowing I was watching. There were no more cards to play, no more guilt to leverage. She was finally entirely cut off. Marcus stepped forward, his posture leaving no room for argument, and escorted her backward until the heavy glass doors sealed shut between them, locking her out in the humid Miami heat. I closed the security application on my tablet and stood up from my desk. I walked across the polished hardwood floor and pushed open the massive glass doors leading out to my private wraparound balcony. The warm, salty ocean breeze immediately washed over me. I stood at the glass railing looking out over the sprawling, vibrant city that I had conquered entirely on my own terms. I took a deep, uninterrupted breath. For the first time in my 31 years of existence, the air felt completely clean. I was whole. I was massively successful. I was finally utterly free. But my journey did not end with my own liberation. The immense wealth I had secured from liquidating their toxic assets was not just a personal victory. It was a weapon for systemic change. Standing on that balcony, I finalized the blueprint for my next major corporate venture. I was launching a comprehensive, heavily endowed legal foundation specifically designed to provide aggressive, top-tier representation for women trapped in cycles of familial financial abuse. I was going to use my capital, my ruthless legal team, and my first-hand experience to dismantle the traps set by toxic parents and manipulative spouses across the country. I was going to turn my profound pain into a fortress for others. To anyone listening to my story who is currently suffocating under the weight of a family that treats love as a transactional currency, hear me clearly. You do not owe your sanity, your finances, or your future to people who only value you for what they can extract. Blood does not give anyone a license to break you. Recognize your absolute worth. Gather your resources in silence, build your safety net, and find the unyielding courage to cut those toxic ties completely. You are capable of building an empire from the ashes of their rejection, and your true life begins the exact moment you walk away and refuse to ever look back. The most profound lesson from Madeline's journey is that biological ties do not excuse toxic behavior or financial abuse. Society often pressures us to forgive family at the expense of our own well-being, but enduring manipulation is certainly not a duty. Madeline teaches us that true strength lies in recognizing your inherent worth and establishing unbreakable boundaries. When you stop allowing abusers to extract your resources and energy, you reclaim your future. Freedom requires the courage to walk away from those who only value you for what you provide. Please take a stand, protect your peace, and comment below today.